Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world that has been hidden for centuries, a world where survival meant waking before dawn, where a single mistake could mean death, and where the women who built medieval Europe have been nearly forgotten by history. Imagine living in a time when there was no running water, no electricity, no hospitals, just you, your bare hands, and the weight of keeping your family alive through another day. This is the story of what daily life was really like for women in small European villages. So before we step back in time together, I want to ask you something. If you are already enjoying what we are exploring tonight, would you take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a like? And here is something I am genuinely curious about. Where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you tucked into bed in New York, sitting by a window in London? Maybe you are driving through the quiet roads of Texas, or perhaps you are halfway across the world in Tokyo. Drop a comment and let me know where you're joining me from tonight. I love knowing that we are all here together, scattered across the globe, but connected by these stories from the past. Now, dim those lights if you can, get comfortable and let us begin. Picture this. It is sometime around the year 1300. The place is a small village called Elton, tucked away in the English countryside about 70 miles north of London. The River Nene flows quietly nearby, and the village is home to maybe a few hundred souls, farmers, craftsmen and their families, all living in a tight cluster of houses made from wood, mud and thatch. There are no streetlights, no cars, no sounds of modern life, just the wind through the trees, the occasional bleat of a sheep, and the distant sound of the river. It is 4 o'clock in the morning. The sky is still pitch black. Inside one of these small houses, really just one room with a dirt floor and a thatched roof, a woman wakes up. Let us call her Agnes. She does not have an alarm clock. She does not need one. Her body has learned over years to wake at this hour, because if she does not, her family will not eat today. Agnes lies on a straw pallet on the floor. Next to her, her husband is still asleep. Their 3 children are curled up nearby under thin woolen blankets. The house is cold, freezing actually, because the fire died down overnight. And here is where Agnes faces her first task of the day. A task so crucial that if she fails at it, everything else falls apart. She needs to bring that fire back to life. Now, you might be thinking, just light a match. But matches would not be invented for another 500 years. Instead, Agnes carefully approaches the hearth, the stone fireplace in the centre of the room, and kneels down. She reaches into the ashes, feeling for the warm embers that she carefully banked the night before. If those embers have gone completely cold, she will have to walk to a neighbour's house to borrow fire. And that means waking someone else up at 4 in the morning, which is not exactly a great way to maintain friendly relations in a village where you depend on your neighbours for survival. But tonight, or this morning rather, she is lucky. Her fingers find warmth. There, buried under the grey ash, are a few glowing red embers. She adds a handful of a dry straw, blows gently, watches the smoke begin to curl upward, then some small twigs, then larger pieces of wood. Within a few minutes, flames are licking upward, and the room begins to warm ever so slightly. This moment, this simple act of rekindling the fire, is not just about warmth. It is about life itself. Without fire, there is no cooked food. Without food, there is no way to boil water to make it safer to drink. Without fire, there is no light to see by, no way to heat the house through the brutal winter months. Medieval women spent years mastering this skill, because fire was not some convenience you could turn on with a switch. It was a living thing that required constant attention, constant care. While the fire grows stronger, Agnes moves to her next task. She fills a large iron pot with water from a bucket near the door. This water was carried yesterday from the village well, and yes, she carried it herself, probably making multiple trips because water is heavy and buckets are not exactly ergonomic. She hangs the pot over the fire and begins preparing what will be breakfast for her family. Pottage. Now, if you've never heard of pottage, imagine a thick soup or porridge made from whatever you have on hand. For Agnes, that means some barley, a few dried peas, maybe an onion, some herbs from the garden if she has them, and whatever leftover bits of food are still edible from yesterday. This is not gourmet cooking. This is survival cooking. The goal is to create something warm and filling that will give her husband and children enough energy to make it through a day of back-breaking labour. As the pottage begins to simmer, filling the room with its earthy smell, Agnes allows herself a moment to think about the day ahead. Her husband will be heading out to the Lord's field soon. He owes the Lord of the Manor several days of work each week, ploughing and planting and harvesting on land that does not belong to him. Her older children will go with him. But Agnes, she has her own work to do, and it is no less demanding. You see, here is something that history forgot for a very long time. When we think about medieval villages, we often imagine men doing all the important work, farming, building, making decisions, but the reality was very different. Women like Agnes were not sitting around in their houses doing a bit of light housework. They were economic powerhouses. Let me tell you about Marjorie. Marjorie was a widow who lived in a village not far from Elton. We know about her because medieval lords kept very detailed records of who owed them what, and Marjorie's name appears in those records. Here is what they say. Marjorie the widow holds 24 acres and she pays 3 shillings every year. From Michaelmas to the Feast of St. Peter she must plough half an acre every week, and from the Feast of St. John the Baptist until August she must perform manual service 3 days every week. She shall mow the Lord's meadow for at least 4 days, and she must lift the Lord's hay for at least 4 days. She shall weed 2 days, and from the Feast of St. Peter until Michaelmas she must perform manual service 5 days a week. Let that sink in for a moment. Marjorie was a woman, a widow, and she was ploughing fields, mowing meadows, lifting hay, weeding, and performing manual labour up to 5 days a week. This was not unusual. This was normal. When a woman's husband died, she often took over his land and his work obligations, and she did it because the alternative was starvation. Back to Agnes. As the pottage cooks and the family begins to stir, she is mentally running through her day. She needs to feed the chickens. She needs to check on the cow. She needs to work in the garden, pulling weeds and checking on the vegetables that will help feed her family through the winter. She needs to spin wool into thread because she is making a new tunic for her oldest son, who is growing so fast that his current one barely covers his knees anymore. And oh yes, she needs to brew ale. Wait, ale? Yes, ale. Here is another thing that might surprise you. In medieval England, most of the ale that people drank was brewed by women. In fact, brewing was considered women's work right alongside cooking and cleaning. And we're not talking about brewing just for your own family. Women brewed ale to sell. It was a business. Imagine this, you are walking through a medieval village and you see a house with a broom hanging over the front door. That broom is a sign. It means, we have ale for sale here. And inside that house you will almost certainly find a woman who has just spent the last several days brewing a batch of ale, heating water, adding grain, letting it ferment, carefully monitoring the whole process to make sure it does not go bad. Why was brewing so important? Because water in medieval times was often unsafe to drink. Rivers were contaminated. Wells could be questionable. But ale, because it was boiled during the brewing process, was much safer. Plus, it had calories, which mattered when you were working from dawn to dusk and needed every bit of energy you could get. So ale was not just a drink, it was a nutritional necessity, and women dominated this industry. There was a woman named Denise Marlaire who lived in the early 1400s. We know she brewed ale for more than 20 years, running a successful business, investing in equipment and supplies, and making enough money to support herself. She was not unique. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of women like her across England, turning their homes into small breweries and selling their product to neighbours. Now, Agnes is not quite at the level of Denise Marlaire. She brews ale for her family and sells a little on the side when she has extra. But even that is a significant amount of work. Brewing ale means hauling water, heating it over the fire, adding the grain, stirring, waiting, checking, and then hoping that the batch does not go bad before you can drink it or sell it. Because here is the thing, ale does not last. Without hops, which would not become common in England for another century or so, ale would go sour within a few days. So you had to brew frequently, and you had to drink or sell it quickly. As the morning light finally begins to creep through the small window, just a hole in the wall really, covered with a shutter, Agnes dishes out the pottage. Her husband eats quickly, standing up, preparing to head out to the fields. The children eat more slowly, still half asleep, and Agnes? She eats while standing at the hearth, planning her day, thinking about everything that needs to be done. Here is what history books did not tell you for the longest time. They made it seem like women's work was somehow less important than men's work. Men ploughed the fields, so that was real labour. Women cooked and cleaned, so that was just housework. Not worth mentioning, not worth recording. But that is a lie, and it is a lie that has hidden the truth about medieval life for centuries. Agnes will spend today doing work that is absolutely essential to her family's survival. She will work in the garden, producing vegetables that will keep them from starving in the winter. She will spin wool, creating the thread that will become the clothing her family wears. She will tend to the animals, which provide milk, eggs, and eventually meat. She will brew ale, which her family will drink and which she might sell for a few precious coins, and if her husband needs help in the fields, if it is harvest time and every hand is needed, she will drop everything and go work alongside him, reaping grain under the hot sun until her back aches and her hands bleed. The economic contribution of women like Agnes was enormous. Historians now estimate that women's work made up a huge percentage of the medieval economy. But because it was women's work, because it happened in and around the home rather than in some official workplace, it was invisible, or rather it was made invisible, by historians who did not think to look for it. But here is the beautiful thing. We are looking for it now, we are finding it now, and we are finally telling the truth about women like Agnes, who woke up before dawn every single day and did the work that kept medieval Europe alive. As the sun rises higher and Agnes begins her day in earnest, there is something else lurking in the back of her mind, something that every medieval woman had to think about, whether she wanted to or not. The reality of childbirth, the knowledge that if she became pregnant again, and she probably would, there was a 1 in 5 chance she would not survive it. But that is a story for the next part of our journey tonight. For now, as the fire crackles and the morning unfolds in medieval Elton, Agnes picks up her spindle and begins to spin wool into thread, her hands moving in a rhythm she has known since childhood, while her mind drifts to all the tasks that await her. This is her life. This is the life of medieval women, and we are only just beginning to understand what it was really like. Let us continue this journey together and discover what else history has hidden from us for so long. There was one reality that haunted every medieval woman, rich or poor, young or old, one fear that lived in the back of their minds from the moment they married until the day they could no longer bear children. and that fear was childbirth. I want you to imagine something for a moment. Imagine that every time you or someone you loved became pregnant, there was a 1 in 5 chance, a 20% chance, that they would not survive. Not because of some rare complication, not because of extraordinary circumstances, just normal childbirth. 1 in 5 women died bringing life into the world. Think about that. If you know 5 women who've given birth, statistically one of them would not have survived if they had lived in medieval times. This was the leading cause of death for women in the Middle Ages. Not disease, not famine, not old age, childbirth. And yet medieval women faced this terrifying reality over and over again, because having children was not optional. It was expected. It was required. It was quite literally their duty. Let me take you into a birthing room in a medieval village. It is the year 1315, and a woman named Eleanor is in labour. She is 23 years old. This is her 3rd pregnancy. Her first child lived. Her second died within a week of being born, a tragedy so common that parents often waited months before naming their babies, just in case. Eleanor's labour began early this morning. By now it is late afternoon and she has been in pain for hours. But here is the thing, she is not alone. In fact, no men are allowed in this room at all. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was an exclusively female ritual. This was a women's territory, women's knowledge, women's domain. Gathered around Eleanor are several women from the village. There is Margaret, the midwife, who has attended dozens of births over the past 20 years. There is Eleanor's mother. There is her sister. There are 2 neighbours, women who Eleanor has known her entire life. They speak in low, encouraging voices. They hold her hands. They wipe her forehead with cool cloths. And they pray. They pray constantly. Margaret, the midwife, is the most important person in this room. In medieval society, midwives were recognised as legitimate medical specialists. They had real authority when it came to women's health. Think about that for a second. In an era when women had very few official roles, very few positions of recognised expertise, midwives stood out. They were acknowledged. They were respected. They were needed. But being a midwife was not just about catching babies. It was about having an encyclopedic knowledge of herbs, remedies and techniques that had been passed down through generations of women. Margaret knows, for instance, that mugwort can ease labour pains. She knows that a tea made from certain herbs can help bring on contractions if labour is stalling. She knows how to position a woman if the baby is not coming out correctly. She knows when to be patient and when to act quickly. Some of this knowledge was even written down. There was a woman named Trota who lived in Salerno, Italy, back in the 12th century, about 100 years before Eleanor's time. Trota was a medical practitioner, a healer, possibly even trained at the famous medical school in Salerno, which was one of the most advanced centres of medical learning in all of Europe. And Trota wrote a book. Actually, her writings became part of a compilation called the Trotula, which included 3 texts: book on the conditions of women, on treatments for women, and on women's cosmetics. This book became the medieval guide to women's health. It discussed miscarriages, pain after birth, signs of pregnancy, treatments for various female ailments. It was copied and recopied, translated and shared, and it influenced medical practice for centuries. The fact that a woman wrote it, that a woman's knowledge formed the basis for treating women's health issues, that matters. That tells us something important about the role women played in medieval medicine, even if later historians tried to forget it. Back in Eleanor's birthing room, Margaret is drawing on all of this accumulated knowledge. She has given Eleanor a mixture of herbs in warm water. She has rubbed Eleanor's belly with an ointment made from rose petals and other ingredients. Rose was believed to have soothing properties, and honestly, even if it was just the power of belief, Anything that helped a labouring woman feel calmer was valuable. But here is the harsh reality. No matter how skilled Margaret is, no matter how much knowledge she possesses, there is only so much she can do. If something goes seriously wrong, if the baby is breech and cannot be turned, if Eleanor starts to hemorrhage if an infection sets in, there are no antibiotics, no surgical interventions, no emergency C-sections. There is just Margaret's hands, her herbs, her experience, and a whole lot of prayer. Do you know what happened when a medieval woman went into labour and it became clear she might not survive? A priest would be called, not to perform a C-section. That was not happening unless the mother was already dead or dying. No, the priest came to give last rites, to hear her final confession, to prepare her soul for death. Imagine being in labour, in the worst pain of your life, and seeing a priest arrive. You would know exactly what that meant. There is a record from the 13th century, a coroner's report, that gives us a glimpse into just how dangerous everyday life was for women. It mentions women who died in accidents related to their work, like the tragic case of Amise, daughter of Robert Bellamy of Staplow, and her friend Sybil. In October of 1270, these two women were working together in a brew house, carrying a large wooden tub full of grout between them. They were heading toward a huge lead vat filled with boiling liquid, intending to empty their tub into it. But Amice slipped. She fell into the boiling vat. The tub fell on top of her. The other members of the household came running when they heard the screams and found Amice scalded almost to death. A chaplain was summoned. Amice received the last rites of the church. By the next morning, around the hour of prime, that is about 6 a.m., she was dead. This story is heartbreaking, but it also tells us something crucial. It tells us that medieval records keepers thought this death was significant enough to write down in detail. It tells us that women were doing dangerous heavy labour, carrying massive tubs of boiling liquid, and it tells us that death was a constant companion lurking in everyday tasks. But let us return to Eleanor. Let us give her story a happier ending, because many births did end well. After hours of labour, after more pain than most of us can imagine, Eleanor delivers a baby girl. The room erupts in relief and quiet celebration. Margaret cuts the umbilical cord, wraps the baby in clean linen, and hands her to Eleanor. The other women begin cleaning up, preparing warm broth for Eleanor to drink, making sure she is comfortable. For the next few weeks, Eleanor will barely leave her bed. This period after birth, called lying in, was when a new mother was supposed to rest and recover. In wealthier families, a woman might stay in her darkened room for a month or more. But for peasant women like Eleanor, that kind of rest was a luxury she could not afford. Within a week, maybe two, she will be back to her regular work, tending the garden, caring for her other children, cooking, cleaning, spinning, brewing. And here is something else that will surprise you. Eleanor will breastfeed this baby herself. Now you might think, well, of course she will, how else would the baby eat? But in wealthier families, noble families, the lady of the house would hire a wet nurse, another woman who would breastfeed the baby for her. This was partly about status. If you were rich enough to hire someone else to do this, it was a sign of your wealth, but it was also practical in a darker way. If you were not breastfeeding, you would likely become pregnant again much sooner, and if your job was to produce heirs, especially male heirs, then you needed to get pregnant as often as possible. Peasant women, though, almost always nursed their own babies. We know this from historical records, from medieval writings, from scholars who studied these communities. A mother like Eleonora would nurse her baby for a year, maybe even 2 years. This was her baby's primary source of nutrition. There was no formula, there were no bottles. If the mother died and there was no wet nurse available, the baby's chances of survival were very, very slim. There is a sermon from the 14th century that gives us this beautiful little glimpse into a mother's love. It describes a scene in winter when a child's hands are cold. The mother takes a straw or a rush, just a piece of dried grass really, and tells the child to warm it. Of course, the straw does not need warming, but as the child presses the straw between their tiny hands trying to warm it, their hands themselves become warmer from the friction, from the movement. The mother is not warming the straw, she is warming her child's hands. It is such a tender image, such a clever little trick, and it tells us that medieval mothers loved their children just as fiercely as mothers do today. The same sermon mentions what a mother does when her child falls ill. She takes a candle to the church and makes a vow in prayers. She is bargaining with God, essentially. Please let my child live and I will do this, I will give that, I will light this candle, I will make this offering. When you have no doctors, no medicine, no hospitals, prayer becomes medicine. Faith becomes treatment. But we also know from coroners' rolls, those detailed records of accidental deaths, that many infants and young children were left alone during the day while their parents worked. This was not neglect, this was necessity. If you were a peasant woman and your husband was working the Lord's fields and you needed to work in your own garden or go help with the harvest, what were you supposed to do with your baby? There were no daycare centres. There were no babysitters on call, so you did what you had to do. You left the baby in the house, maybe in a cradle near the hearth, and you hoped everything would be okay. And usually it was, but sometimes it was not. Sometimes the baby rolled into the fire. Sometimes the toddler wandered out and fell into a well or a pond. The coroner's rolls are full of these tragedies and they break your heart. Older children had a better chance. They would be left with a neighbour or an older sibling, or maybe a young girl from the village who was paid a few pennies to watch them. But even then, accidents happened all the time. Medieval villages were dangerous places, especially for small children. Here is a statistic that should make you pause. Medieval children had about a 50% survival rate beyond their first year of life. 50%. That means if you had 2 babies, you could reasonably expect that one of them would not make it to their second birthday. This was normal. This was expected. Parents loved their children desperately, but they also had to brace themselves for loss. And think about what this meant for women. You would spend 9 months pregnant, endure the agony and danger of childbirth, survive the bleeding and the pain and the risk of infection in the weeks afterward, nurse your baby for a year or 2, pour all of your love and care into this tiny human being. And there was a coin flip's chance that they would die before they learned to walk. And then you would get pregnant again and do it all over. This is why women in medieval times were often pregnant almost constantly. Wealthy women especially, who had a duty to produce heirs, might go through 10, 12, 15 pregnancies in their lifetime. How many of those children survived? Maybe half, maybe fewer. Every pregnancy was a roll of the dice, both for the mother and for the child. There is a reason why medieval women often looked so much older than their actual age. There are descriptions of women in their 30s or 40s who were worn down, exhausted, their bodies ravaged by pregnancy after pregnancy, by constant labour, by poor nutrition. It is no wonder that some historians initially thought medieval people aged faster than we do today. They did not age faster. They were just worked to the bone. Now, I want to be clear about something. I am not trying to make you feel sorry for medieval women. That is not the point of this story. The point is to show you how incredibly strong they were. They faced odds that would break most of us, and they kept going. They woke up before dawn, they worked until they could barely stand, they endured pain and loss that we can barely imagine. And they did it without complaint, without recognition, without anyone writing down their names or telling their stories. Eleanor, the woman we imagined in labour earlier, might have her name recorded in a church registry when her baby was baptized. But beyond that, history would forget her. She would disappear into the anonymous mass of peasant women or medieval women, or just women. No biography, no memorial, no acknowledgement of everything she endured and achieved. But we are acknowledging it now. We are saying their names when we can find them. We are telling their stories. We are making visible what was invisible for so long. As Eleanor holds her new daughter close as the other women in the room finally relax and share a cup of ale to celebrate the safe delivery, as the winter sun sets outside and the village settles into evening quiet, there is a whole world of women's work still to explore. Because childbirth was just one part of their lives, these women were also healers, herbalists, keepers of medical knowledge that would be passed down through generations. And that is where we're going next, into the gardens and the healing rooms, into the secret knowledge that women held about herbs and remedies and the power to cure or kill. Stay with me. If you walk through a medieval village on a summer morning, you would notice something unusual. Behind nearly every house, no matter how poor, there was a small garden, and in those gardens grew plants that could heal you or kill you depending on how they were used. This was the apothecary of the Middle Ages. This was where medicine lived. And the pharmacists? They were women. Let me introduce you to a woman whose name has echoed through 8 centuries. Her name was Hildegard von Bingen, and she was born in 1098 in what is now Germany. Hildegard was many things: a nun, a composer, a mystic, a writer, but she was also one of the most important medical practitioners of her time, and she wrote it all down. In the 12th century, Hildegard composed 2 massive works on medicine and natural history. One was called Physica, and the other was Causae et Curae, which translates to causes and cures. These books contained everything she knew about plants, minerals, animals, and how to use them to treat illness. We are talking about hundreds of remedies, detailed instruction, observations about how the human body works. This was cutting-edge medical knowledge, and it came from a woman. Now, Hildegard was unusual because she was educated, because she could write, because she lived in a convent where she had time to study and document her knowledge. But the knowledge itself, that was not unusual at all. Women everywhere, in convents, in castles, in tiny village cottages, possessed deep understanding of healing. They had to, because when someone got sick, there was no doctor to call, there was no hospital to rush to. There was just you, and whatever you knew about plants and prayers and remedies passed down from your grandmother. Think about this. In medieval society, there was an understanding that every household had someone responsible for healthcare. And who do you think that person was? A medieval scholar named Margaret Wade Labarge studied this question extensively, and here is what she found. The woman at the head of a household, whatever its size or importance, seems to have been responsible for the health of those within her sphere of influence. Read that again. The woman at the head of the household, not a doctor, not a physician, the woman. Whether you were a peasant with a one-room cottage or a noblewoman with a castle, if someone in your household got sick, it was your job to fix it. This was just expected. This was normal. So what did these women know? What was growing in those gardens behind their houses? Let me take you on a walk through a medieval herb garden and show you. First, you would almost certainly find wormwood. Now, if you know anything about absinthe, that bright green alcoholic drink that was popular in the 19th century, you know wormwood. It is the plant that gives absinthe its distinctive flavour and its somewhat dangerous reputation. But in the Middle Ages, wormwood was medicine. It was used to treat headaches and fevers. It was also used to treat what medieval people called worms of the womb, which probably referred to various gynecological infections or parasites. The plant itself is silvery bitter and powerfully aromatic. If you crush the leaves between your fingers, the scent is intense, almost overwhelming. Medieval women would make teas from it or create ointments, or burn it as incense. The name Artemisia, the scientific name for wormwood, comes from the Greek goddess Artemis, the goddess of chastity and childbirth. Even the ancient Greeks connected this plant with women's health. Right next to the wormwood, you would likely find mugwort. It is a relative of wormwood but less silvery, less pungent. In a famous 9th century poem called Hortulus, written by a monk named Walafrid Strabo, mugwort was called the mother of herbs. Why? Because it was believed to ease childbirth, cleanse the womb, and restore a woman's menstrual cycle, what medieval people poetically called her flowers. Can you imagine the knowledge required to use these plants correctly? You had to know when to harvest them, the time of year, the time of day, because the potency of plants changes depending on when you pick them. You had to know how to prepare them, dried or fresh, boiled or crushed, mixed with oil or water. You had to know the dosage. Too little, and it would not work. Too much, and it could poison someone. This was not casual knowledge. This was expertise that took years to develop. And here is something fascinating. Mugwort was also used to flavour beer in the Middle Ages. Before hops became the standard ingredient in beer, brewers used a mixture of herbs called groot, and mugwort was a common component. So the same plant that a midwife used to help a woman in labour was also the plant that a brewster used to make the ale that everyone drank with dinner. Women controlled both of these spheres, healing and brewing, and in some ways they were not that different. Both required understanding plants, both required precision, both required knowledge passed down through generations. Let's talk about rose for a moment. Now, when you think of roses in the Middle Ages, you probably picture romance, right? Knights giving roses to ladies, courtly love, all of that. And yes, roses were symbolic and beautiful, but they were also medicine. Hildegard von Bingen wrote about roses in her book Physica. She said you could cook rose petals with sage and fresh melted lard in water to make an ointment. This ointment was used for all sorts of ailments: skin conditions, wounds, inflammation. Rose was also believed to be beneficial during childbirth. The sweet smell was thought to calm a labouring woman, to create a peaceful atmosphere. Was this just superstition? Maybe, but maybe not. We know now that aromatherapy can have real psychological effects. If smelling roses made a woman feel calmer during labour, if it reduced her stress even a little bit, that was valuable. That could make a difference. Here is something that might make you uncomfortable. Medieval women also knew about plants that could end a pregnancy. They knew about pennyroyal, about rue, about savin. These were dangerous plants. In the wrong doses they could kill you. But women knew about them. Women whispered about them. Women used them when they needed to, when another pregnancy meant certain death, when they already had more children than they could feed. The church, of course, condemned this, but the knowledge persisted anyway, handed down from mother to daughter, from midwife to apprentice, in quiet conversations that men were not part of. This was dangerous knowledge, forbidden knowledge, but also necessary knowledge, from the perspective of women who were trying to survive in a world that gave them very little control over their own bodies. Let me tell you about a specific remedy that shows just how detailed this knowledge was. There is a medieval medical text that describes how to treat a prolapsed uterus, a condition that sometimes happens after childbirth where the uterus partially comes out of the body. It is painful, dangerous, and if not treated properly, it can lead to infection and death. The medieval remedy? Take specific herbs, make them into a fumigation, basically burn them and have the woman sit over the smoke. Then create a pessary, an herbal mixture inserted into the vagina to help push everything back into place. And then bed rest, specific prayers and careful monitoring. Does that sound primitive to you? It should not, because doctors were using similar techniques well into the 20th century. Medieval women understood anatomy in ways that are frankly remarkable, given that they were not allowed to attend medical schools, were not allowed to dissect bodies, were not allowed official training of any kind. But here is the thing, they did not need official training. They had something better. They had centuries of accumulated observation. Every midwife who had attended hundreds of births, who had seen what worked and what did not, who had watched women survive or die and noted the patterns, that was research. That was science. It just was not written down in Latin in a university. It was whispered in vernacular languages in birthing rooms and kitchens and gardens. Now I want to be clear. Medieval medicine was limited. Very limited. Women died from infections that antibiotics could easily cure today. Children died from fevers that we could bring down with a simple medication. If you broke a bone badly, if you developed appendicitis, if you had any number of serious conditions, the chances of survival were not good. Prayer was often the best medicine available, not because it was effective, but because nothing else was. But within those limitations, women did remarkable things. They understood that certain molds growing on bread could help with infections, and yes, that is basically penicillin, though they did not know why it worked. They understood that willow bark could reduce pain and fever, and yes, that is essentially aspirin, because willow bark contains salicylic acid. They understood that honey had antibacterial properties, that certain plants could induce vomiting if someone had been poisoned, that cold water could bring down a dangerous fever, and they understood women's bodies in particular. Because here is something crucial, male physicians were generally terrified of women's bodies. Childbirth, that was women's business. Gynecological issues, women's business. Menstruation, definitely women's business. Male doctors wanted nothing to do with it. They considered it unclean, mysterious, frightening. So women became the experts by default, and then they became actual experts. Midwives did not just deliver babies. They treated all manner of women's health issues, heavy bleeding, painful periods, infections, fertility problems, postpartum depression, though they did not call it that. They might call it melancholy or weakness of spirit, but they recognized it and tried to treat it with herbs, rest, and community support. There is a beautiful passage in the Trotula, remember that medical text we talked about earlier, that discusses treatments for women after childbirth. It recommends warm baths with healing herbs. It recommends specific foods to restore strength. It recommends that the new mother be kept warm, kept comfortable, kept surrounded by other women who can help her. This is postpartum care. This is recognizing that a woman who has just given birth needs time to heal, needs support, needs gentle treatment. Compare that to the idea that women should just bounce back immediately after childbirth, should be back to work within days, should not complain about pain or exhaustion. Medieval women, for all their hardships, at least had this, a cultural understanding that childbirth was trauma, that recovery took time, that women needed to be cared for in those vulnerable weeks afterward. Of course, peasant women could not always afford that luxury. As we talked about before, they might be back in the fields within a week or two because they had no choice. But the ideal existed. The knowledge existed. Women knew what women needed, even if circumstances did not always allow them to provide it. Let me ask you something. When you think about medical history, who do you picture? Probably men in robes studying cadavers, right? Or maybe ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates or Galen. You probably do not picture a woman in a medieval cottage garden, carefully harvesting mugwort at dawn, drying it in bundles hung from the ceiling, teaching her daughter which leaves to use and how to prepare them. But that woman, that anonymous woman whose name we will never know, she was just as much a medical practitioner as any physician. She just was not called one. She was not honoured as one. She was not remembered as one. Until now, because we are remembering. We are honouring that knowledge. We are recognising that women were the primary healthcare providers for most of human history. And they did it with nothing but plants, prayers, and generations of careful observation. As the sun climbs higher over our medieval village, as women tend their gardens and gather their herbs and prepare their remedies, there is another vast world of women's work to explore. Because healing was just one of their skills, there was another craft, another essential task that quite literally held medieval society together, thread by thread, hour by hour, in a rhythm that never stopped. The spindle was waiting. The wool needed spinning. And this work, more than almost any other, defined what it meant to be a woman in the Middle Ages. Let us follow that thread and see where it takes us. Close your eyes for a moment and listen. Can you hear it? That soft, rhythmic sound, a gentle whirring, a quiet whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. That is the sound of a spindle turning, of wool becoming thread, of a woman's hands doing the work that clothed all of Europe for 1,000 years. This sound was so constant, so ever-present in medieval life, that it became invisible, but without it, civilization would have frozen to death. Here is a word you probably know, spinster. Today it means an unmarried woman, often with a slightly negative connotation, right? An old maid. But do you know where that word came from? A spinster was literally a woman who spins. That was her profession, her identity, her contribution to the economy. And here is the remarkable thing, in medieval England nearly 100% of all spinning was done by women. 100%. If you wanted thread, you needed a woman's hands. Let me paint you a picture of what this actually looked like. It is late afternoon in our village. The main work of the day is winding down. A woman named Beatrice sits on a small stool outside her cottage door, taking advantage of the last good light. In her left hand she holds a distaff, a long wooden stick with a clump of raw wool attached to the top. It looks almost like she is holding a fuzzy cloud on a stick. In her right hand she holds a spindle, a weighted wooden rod that hangs from a thread. Here is how it works. Beatrice pulls a few fibres from the wool on the distaff. She attaches them to the thread on the spindle. Then she gives the spindle a twist, sets it spinning like a top, and as it spins, it pulls the fibres and twists them into thread. When the spindle gets close to the ground, she winds the new thread around it and starts again. Pull, twist, spin, wind. Pull, twist, spin, wind, over and over and over. How long does this take? Well, to make enough thread for one garment, let us say a simple tunic, Beatrice might need to spin for 40 or 50 hours, and that is just the spinning. After spinning comes weaving, which takes another substantial chunk of time. So when you wore clothes in the Middle Ages, you were wearing dozens of hours of someone's labour, usually a woman's labour. Now you might be thinking, okay, but how hard can spinning be? You're just sitting there twisting wool, right? Let me tell you, spinning is a skill that takes years to master. The thread needs to be even. If you twist too tight, it gets wiry and stiff. If you twist too loose, it falls apart. You need to maintain consistent tension, consistent thickness, consistent twist. And you need to do this while also watching children, while also talking to neighbours, while also keeping an eye on the pot over the fire to make sure dinner does not burn. Medieval women became so skilled at spinning that they could do it while walking, while talking, while supervising their households. Their hands just knew. The movements became automatic. Muscle memory developed over thousands of hours made it possible to spin without really thinking about it. This is why spinning was the perfect work for women whose lives were full of interruptions. A baby needs feeding. Put down the spindle, nurse the baby, pick up the spindle again. A chicken gets into the garden, put down the spindle, chase the chicken, pick up the spindle again. The work could be picked up and put down endlessly, fitting into all the cracks and gaps of daily life. But here is what historians missed for the longest time. They thought of spinning as just this background activity, this minor domestic chore. They did not realize, or they did not want to acknowledge, that spinning was work, real, economically valuable work. The thread that women produced was not just for their own families. It was a commodity. It could be sold, it could be traded, it could generate income. England's primary industry during the Middle Ages was woolen cloth production. Wool from English sheep was famous across Europe for its quality, and the production of that cloth required an enormous amount of labour. First, the raw wool had to be cleaned, washed to remove dirt and lanolin. Then it had to be carded, combed with special brushes to align the fibres and remove tangles. Then it had to be spun into thread. Then the thread had to be woven into cloth. Then the cloth had to be fulled, washed and beaten to make it thicker and stronger. Then it might be dyed. Then it might be finished with various processes to make it softer or smoother. Women dominated several of these steps. Washing wool, women's work. Carding wool, women's work. Spinning wool into thread, almost exclusively women's work. This was not a small cottage industry. This was the backbone of the English economy. Woolen cloth was England's biggest export. It made fortunes for merchants. It filled the king's treasury with tax revenue, and it all depended on women's hands. Let me give you some numbers. In the 14th century, England was producing millions of yards of woolen cloth every year. To produce that much cloth, you needed an absolutely staggering amount of thread. And to produce that thread, you needed thousands upon thousands of women spinning every single day. Historians have estimated that it took about 4 spinners to keep one weaver supplied with thread. 4 to 1. Think about that ratio. For every person weaving cloth, you needed 4 people making the thread. This is why spinning was so common, so universal. Every woman knew how to do it. Every household had the equipment for it. Little girls learned by watching their mothers and grandmothers, and by the time they were teenagers, their hands were already skilled. By the time they were adults, they could spin thread that was fine and even, thread that weavers would pay good money for. And yes, women sold their thread. We have records of this. We have account books from medieval merchants showing payments to women for spun yarn. We have court cases involving disputes over the quality of thread. We have guild regulations trying to set standards for how thread should be spun. This was a real market, with real money changing hands. But here is the sad part. Spinning paid very little. The work was so common, so many women could do it, that the wages were low. A woman might spin for hours and hours and earn just a few pennies. It was not enough to live on independently. It was supplemental income, money that helped a family get by, that bought a few extra necessities, that kept starvation a little further away. This is why spinning was particularly important for certain groups of women, elderly women for instance. As women aged and became less able to do heavy farm work, spinning became their contribution to the household. They could sit by the fire and spin, their gnarled fingers still skillful, still productive. Widows often supported themselves partly through spinning. Women with disabilities that prevented them from doing field work could still spin. The sedentary nature of the work made it accessible. You did not need great strength. You did not need to be able to walk long distances. You just needed working hands and the knowledge of how to use them. There is something almost meditative about spinning, actually. That rhythmic motion, that focus on the thread forming under your fingers, the soft whoosh of the spindle. In a life that was often chaotic and unpredictable, spinning provided a kind of anchor, something you could control, something you could take pride in. A good spinner, a woman whose thread was fine and even and strong, had a reputation. People knew her work. They sought it out. Let me tell you about something that shows just how deeply spinning was woven into medieval women's identity. In illuminated manuscripts, those beautifully decorated medieval books, when artists wanted to depict a virtuous woman, they often showed her spinning. There is a famous image from a 14th century Psalter that shows the Virgin Mary herself with a spindle in her hand. Mary, the mother of Jesus, doing the work that every medieval woman did. That tells you something about how fundamental this was, but let us talk about the bigger picture for a moment. Textile production, spinning, weaving, finishing, was not just important for clothing. It was important for the entire structure of medieval society. Think about it. Every single person needed clothes. Not just one outfit, but multiple garments, because clothes wore out, because you needed different weights for different seasons, because you grew out of things, or they rotted, or they got torn beyond repair. And making those clothes from scratch, starting with a sheep and ending with a finished garment, took hundreds of hours of labour. Hundreds. So if you wanted to have enough clothes for your family, someone in that family needed to be producing thread constantly. Month after month, year after year, the work never ended. This is part of why women's workload was so crushing. They were not just spinning for the sake of spinning. They were spinning because their family needed clothes and could not afford to buy them. They were spinning because the alternative was freezing in winter or going around in rags. The work was not optional. It was survival. Now, here is where things get interesting. Remember how I said that spinning was almost exclusively done by women? Well, weaving was different. Weaving, especially weaving on large looms, was often done by men. Why? Partly because weaving on a big loom required more physical strength. The loom itself was heavy. The beams that held the cloth were heavy, but also weaving was higher status work. It paid better. And whenever work paid better, men tended to take it over and push women out. This is a pattern you will see again and again in medieval economic history. Women dominate a certain type of work when it is low paid and low status. But as soon as that work becomes profitable, as soon as guilds form and standards get set and money starts flowing, suddenly it becomes men's work. We saw this with brewing, actually. Early in the Middle Ages, brewing was women's work. But by the 15th century, as brewing became more commercialized and more profitable, men took it over. Women were pushed out of the industry they had created. The same thing happened in other textile trades. The silk industry is a fascinating exception. In medieval Europe, especially in places like Paris, silk production was dominated by women. Women controlled every step of the process, spinning the silk thread, weaving it, finishing it. There were female guild masters, female supervisors, female business owners in the silk trade. This was rare. This was special. And it shows that when women were allowed to control an industry from top to bottom, they excelled. But in most other areas of textile work, women got stuck at the bottom of the economic ladder. They did the time-consuming, low-paid spinning, while men did the more prestigious weaving and finishing. And yet, without the women's work, the men's work could not happen. Without thread, there is no cloth. It is that simple. Here is something that makes me a little bit angry when I think about it. For centuries, literally centuries, historians had wrote about the medieval textile industry and barely mentioned women. They wrote about guilds and merchants and trade regulations and technological innovations. They wrote about the wealth generated by cloth production, about how it funded cathedrals and wars and royal courts. But they did not write about the women whose hands made the thread that made the cloth that made the wealth. It is only in recent decades, as social historians started asking different questions and looking at different sources, that we started to see the truth. Women were not peripheral to the textile industry, they were central to it. They were the foundation. And for most of them, this work was done for tiny wages, or no wages at all, just for their families, just to keep everyone clothed, just because it had to be done. I want you to imagine Beatrice again, sitting outside her cottage in the fading light, her spindle turning, her hands moving in that ancient rhythm. She has been spinning since she was 7 years old. She is now 45. That means she has been spinning for 38 years. If she spent even just an hour a day spinning, though it was probably more, that is nearly 14,000 hours of her life spent turning wool into thread. 14,000 hours. That is more than a year and a half of continuous work. And Beatrice is just one woman in one village. Multiply that by millions of women across Europe, across centuries, and you begin to grasp the scale of this labour. This invisible, undervalued, absolutely essential labour. As the sun sets and Beatrice finally winds up her thread and heads inside to prepare the evening meal, as spindles fall silent across the village and women turn to their other endless tasks, we need to follow these women beyond their cottages, beyond their gardens. Because there is another world waiting, the world of the fields, where the real back-breaking work happened. Where women laboured under the sun from planting to harvest, where the line between men's work and women's work blurred into simple necessity, where danger lurked in every task. The fields are calling, and we need to see what daily life was really like when the entire village turned toward the rhythm of the harvest. Let us walk out into those fields together. The August sun beats down mercilessly on the open fields. There is no shade out here, no relief from the heat that shimmers above the golden wheat. And standing in that heat, bent double with the sickle in her hand, is a woman we will call Joan. She has been here since dawn. It is now midday. Her back screams in protest. Her hands are blistered. Sweat runs down her face and stings her eyes. But she cannot stop. She cannot even slow down. Because if this grain is not harvested in the next few days before the weather turns, her family will starve this winter. This is the reality that history books somehow managed to gloss over for centuries. When they talked about medieval agriculture, they showed images of men ploughing fields, men sowing seeds, men bringing in the harvest. And yes, men did those things, but so did women. Women were right there in the fields, working just as hard, just as long, doing work that was just as backbreaking. The only difference, they also had to go home and cook dinner. Let me tell you what a harvest day actually looked like for a medieval village woman. Joan woke up at 4 a.m, just like Agnes in our earlier story. She lit the fire, she prepared pottage for her family's breakfast. She fed the chickens, milked the cow, made sure her children were dressed and ready. Then, and this is the part that should make you tired just thinking about it, then she walked out to the fields and began a full day of agricultural labour. Reaping grain with a sickle is not easy work. You bend at the waist, grab a handful of wheat stalks with one hand, and with the other hand you swing the sickle, a curved blade about a foot long, to cut the stalks near the ground. Then you lay those stalks aside in a neat bundle. Then you move forward a step and do it again and again and again for hours, for the entire day. Your back hurts because you're bent over constantly. Your hands hurt from gripping the rough stalks and the wooden handle of the sickle. Your arms hurt from the repetitive swinging motion. And if you are not careful, you can easily slice your hand open with that blade, because you're working fast, working tired, and accidents happen. How much did women get paid for this work? Oh, this is going to make you angry. We have documents from the medieval period, wonderful detailed documents kept by manorial lords who tracked every penny, that tell us exactly how much men and women were paid for the same work. For reaping grain, a man might earn 8 pence per day, a woman doing the exact same work, 5 pence. Let me say that again. Same work, same hours, same fulfilled. But if you were a woman, you got paid about 60% of what a man earned. Or look at haymaking. Men were paid 6 pence per day, women got 4 pence. This was not because women were doing easier work or working fewer hours. This was pure discrimination. This was society deciding that a woman's labour was worth less simply because she was a woman, and yet despite being paid less, despite being valued less, women's labour was absolutely essential. In fact, historians now recognise that women were a critical part of the harvest workforce. When grain needed to be brought in quickly, and it always needed to be brought in quickly, because weather in England is unpredictable, and rain could ruin everything, every able-bodied person went to the fields. Men, women, teenagers, elderly people who could still swing a sickle, even children old enough to help gather the cut grain into sheaves. This was called a boon work, or a precaria in Latin. Essentially, it was a community harvest day when the entire village came together to bring in the Lord's grain, and in exchange for their labour, the Lord would provide a feast. Now, when I say feast, do not imagine some lavish medieval banquet with roasted meats and fine wines. We are talking about better than usual food, maybe some ale, maybe some cheese and bread that was not quite as stale as usual. It was a small reward for exhausting work, but it was also a rare moment of community celebration. Picture this scene. It is late August. The entire village is in the fields. Men are cutting grain with scythes, which are larger and heavier than sickles and require more strength to wield. Women and older children are following behind with sickles, cutting what the men missed, gathering everything into bundles. Younger children are running around collecting stray stalks because every single grain counts. Elderly folks are tying the bundles together and stacking them upright to dry. Everyone is working, everyone is sweating, everyone is tired. But there is also laughter. There are songs, there is gossip being shared, jokes being told, flirtations happening between young people. Because this is one of the few times when the whole community is together, when the rigid social hierarchies relax just a little bit, when everyone, from the poorest villager to the Lord's steward, is focused on the same goal: get the grain in before the weather turns. And Joan is right in the middle of it all. Her children are here, the older ones helping with the work, the younger ones playing at the edge of the field under the watchful eye of an elderly neighbour. Her husband is working nearby with a scythe. Her sister is beside her, the two of them working in rhythm, occasionally exchanging a word or a look that conveys volumes without needing to speak. This is community. This is survival. This is what it actually meant to live in a medieval village. But we need to talk about something darker now, because working in the fields was not just exhausting, it was dangerous, especially for women. There is a reason why women working outside the village, away from the protective cluster of houses and neighbours, were considered to be at risk. Medieval documents are quite clear about this. Women working in fields were vulnerable to assault, to rape, to violence. The manorial court records, those detailed accounts of crimes and disputes, contain case after case of attacks on women who were working in isolated areas. This is hard to talk about, but it is important. Medieval women lived with this fear. They had to. Going out to work in the fields meant exposing yourself to potential danger. But what choice did they have? The work had to be done. Families needed food. So women went out anyway, often in groups for safety, always alert, always aware that they were vulnerable. And then there were the accidents. We talked earlier about Amice, who fell into a boiling vat in a brewhouse and died. But fieldwork had its own dangers. People fell from haystacks and broke their necks. They were kicked by oxen and trampled by horses. They cut themselves badly with sickles and scythes and bled to death before help could arrive. They collapsed from heat exhaustion on scorching summer days. Medieval coroners' rolls, the records kept of sudden or suspicious deaths, are full of these tragedies. And what strikes you when you read them is how matter-of-fact they are. On such and such a date, so-and-so died while working in the field. It was common enough to barely warrant comment. Death was always close in medieval life, and fieldwork brought you particularly close to its edge. Now, I want to tell you about a specific type of woman who really challenges everything we think we know about medieval gender roles. Widows who ran farms. These women were not rare. They were not exceptional. They were actually fairly common, and their existence proves something important. Women were absolutely capable of doing all the same agricultural work that men did. Remember Marjorie, the widow we talked about earlier? Let me remind you of what the record said about her. She held 24 acres of land. She had to plough, she had to mow meadows, she had to lift hay, she had to weed, she had to perform manual service up to 5 days a week at certain times of year. This was not light work, this was running a farm, and Marjorie was not unique. Across medieval England there were hundreds, probably thousands of widows managing land, fulfilling work obligations, making decisions about planting and harvesting and livestock. When their husbands died, these women stepped into their shoes and did the work. Because the alternative was losing their land, their livelihood, their ability to feed their children. Think about what this means. It means that the idea that women could not do heavy agricultural work is a lie. They could, they did. We have the documentation to prove it. The claim that ploughing was too physically demanding for women? Well, widows ploughed. The claim that certain types of fieldwork required male strength? Widows did that work too. So why did society insist on treating women's agricultural labour as somehow secondary or supportive? Why did they pay women less for the same work? It was not about capability. It was about power. It was about maintaining a social order where men held authority and women were subordinate. Even when women were doing identical work, even when they were proving themselves just as capable, the system found ways to devalue their contribution. Here's another thing that is fascinating. During harvest time, the normal rules about what was women's work versus men's work often broke down completely. Everybody did everything. If you were capable of holding a sickle, you were in the fields cutting grain. If you could lift a bundle of hay, you were lifting hay. If you could drive a cart, you were driving a cart. Gender divisions mattered less than getting the work done before the weather changed, or the grain got too ripe and started falling off the stalk. This tells us something important. The strict separation of men's work and women's work that medieval society claimed to believe in was actually pretty flexible in practice. When survival was on the line, when the harvest was at risk, everybody pitched in regardless of gender. It was only when things were more relaxed, when there was time to think about social norms and proper behaviour, that those rigid divisions reasserted themselves. Let me take you through the agricultural year from a woman's perspective, because it was not just about harvest. Every season had its own demands. Spring was planting time. Women helped sow seeds, scattering them by hand across ploughed fields in a motion that looks easy, but actually requires skill to do evenly. They tended vegetable gardens, planting the peas and beans and onions that would supplement the family's diet. They helped with lambing season, staying up through cold nights to assist ewes giving birth, making sure the newborn lambs survived those critical first hours. Summer was weeding time. Have you ever tried to weed a garden? Now imagine weeding an entire field, on your hands and knees, in the heat, for days on end. This was women's work, definitely women's work, and it was miserable. But it had to be done because weeds would choke out the crops and reduce the yield. Autumn was harvest, which we've already talked about. But it was not just grain harvest. There was fruit to pick and preserve. There were nuts to gather from the woods. There were vegetables to harvest and store for winter. Women were deeply involved in all of this. Winter was the quietest season for field work, but even then there was work to be done. Animals needed tending every single day. The livestock needed feeding, needed water, needed their shelters cleaned. And women did a lot of this work, especially with smaller animals like chickens and pigs. Do you see the pattern here? There was no season when women rested. There was no time of year when they could just focus on the house and leave the outdoor work to men. They were always working inside and outside, cooking and cleaning, and farming and tending animals and spinning and brewing and raising children and every other thing that needed doing. Joan, our woman in the wheat field, finally straightens her back as the sun begins to sink toward the horizon. The grain is cut. The bundles are tied. Most of it has been carried to the barn already. She is exhausted in a way that goes bone deep, but there is also satisfaction. The harvest is in. Her family will eat this winter. She has done her part to make that happen. As she walks home with the other women, their voices tired but cheerful, talking about the feast that awaits them, about how their backs hurt, about how they will sleep well tonight, we need to remember something. These women were not victims. Yes, their lives were hard. Yes, they were undervalued and underpaid and overworked. But they were also strong, capable, essential. They were the backbone of medieval agriculture, even if no one bothered to write that down at the time. But there is more to their story, because beyond the fields, beyond the daily grind of survival, there was another world where women's knowledge mattered in ways that went far beyond spinning and harvesting. There was a world of food, of cooking, of transforming raw ingredients into sustenance. And in that world, in the smoky kitchens and around the communal ovens, women wielded a different kind of power. The power to feed or to let starve. The power to make a meagre harvest stretch through a long winter. The power to turn almost nothing into something that could keep a family alive. Let us step into those kitchens and see what medieval women created from the little they had. Smoke curls upward from every cottage in the village as evening approaches. And if you could peek inside any one of those small homes, you would see the same thing. A woman standing over a fire, stirring a pot, performing what might be the most important work of the entire day. Because you can harvest all the grain in the world, but if no one knows how to turn it into food that will keep you alive through winter, you will starve anyway. Let me introduce you to a piece of medieval life that existed in almost every household. It was called the pottage kettle. This was a large iron pot, usually hanging from a hook over the fire, and it contained whatever you had. Pottage was somewhere between a thick soup and a thin porridge. It was the main dish. The everyday sustenance, the thing that kept medieval families from starvation. And making it well enough to be nutritious, making it stretch far enough to feed everyone, making it taste like something other than despair, that was an art form. A woman named Catherine stands at her hearth as the winter sun sets outside. In her pot she has put barley, some dried peas that she soaked overnight, an onion from the storage basket, some herbs from the bunches hanging from the ceiling, maybe thyme, maybe parsley, a bit of salt if she has any, and water, lots of water. She will let this simmer for hours, stirring occasionally, adding more water if it gets too thick, until the grains have broken down and the peas have dissolved into a kind of mush, and the whole thing has become a warm, filling meal. Does this sound appetizing to you? Probably not. But here is the thing, when you are hungry, when you have been working all day in the cold, when this bowl of pottage is the difference between going to bed with your stomach aching from emptiness, or going to bed with at least some warmth in your belly, it tastes pretty good. And more importantly, it keeps you alive. Medieval diets were to put it mildly, limited. For peasants, which was most people, the staples were grain, grain, and more grain. Bread was the foundation of every meal. Pottage was the main dish. Ale was the beverage. Everything else was supplemental, seasonal, or for special occasions only. Let me give you an idea of what the average person was actually eating. Bread made from barley or rye, not wheat. Wheat was expensive, so wheat bread was for the wealthy. Peasants got the darker, heavier breads made from cheaper grains. Pottage, as we discussed. Ale, weak ale, the kind that had maybe 2 or 3% alcohol, just enough that the boiling process had made the water safer to drink. And then whatever vegetables were available. In spring and summer, that might be cabbage, lettuce, leeks, spinach, parsley. In autumn, you might have nuts and berries gathered from the woods. In winter, you were eating whatever you managed to preserve or store. Protein was the serious shortage. Meat was rare. We are not talking about having meat once a week. We are talking about maybe having meat a few times a year for special feast days. If you were lucky, you might have a chicken that laid eggs. You might have a cow that gave milk, which you could turn into cheese. But you could not afford to slaughter that cow for meat because then you would lose the milk. The animals were more valuable alive than dead. Fish was more common, especially if you lived near a river or the coast. But even fish was not an everyday occurrence for most peasants. More often you ate what you could grow in your garden, what you could gather from the commons, the shared land where villagers could forage, and what you could make from grain. Here is what historians have figured out about medieval peasant diets, and it should concern you. They were often seriously deficient in several key nutrients. Protein, as I mentioned, but also lipids, fats. Medieval peasants were not getting enough fat in their diets, which sounds like a modern health dream, but actually it is a problem. Your body needs fat to function properly. They were also low in calcium, which you get from dairy products, and vitamins A, C, and D. You know what happens when your diet lacks vitamin C for an extended period? You get scurvy, your gums bleed, your teeth fall out, wounds do not heal properly. Many medieval peasants probably had mild scurvy without even knowing what it was. They just knew they felt weak and their gums hurt. Vitamin D deficiency causes rickets in children, bones that do not grow properly, that bow and break easily. Vitamin A deficiency causes night blindness, makes you more susceptible to infections. So when we talk about medieval people being small, being sick frequently, dying young, part of that is because they were literally malnourished from birth. And who was responsible for trying to squeeze adequate nutrition out of inadequate resources? Women. Catherine, standing at her pot, is not just cooking dinner. She is trying to keep her family alive with whatever ingredients she has available. She knows, probably from experience, from watching her own siblings or children suffer, that certain foods are better than others. She knows that green vegetables help somehow, even if she does not know about vitamins. She knows that variety is important, even if the reasons are a mystery to her. Let me tell you about a medieval saying that I find both heartbreaking and revealing. Medieval cooks would say, "Anything that grew went into the pot." Anything. Even things we would not consider food today. Primrose leaves, strawberry leaves, young dandelion greens, roots that we would think of as weeds. If it was not poisonous or unbearably bitter, it went in, because every little bit of nutrition mattered. The really dangerous time was late winter and early spring. This was called the hungry gap. By February or March, you'd been eating from your stored food for months. The grain supply was running low. The preserved vegetables were gone or going bad. But the new crops had not grown yet. There was almost nothing fresh available. This was when people starved. This was when children died quietly in the night because their bodies just gave out. Catherine knows about the hungry gap. Everyone knows about it. So in autumn, when food is relatively plentiful, she works frantically to preserve everything she can. Vegetables are dried and hung up. Grain is stored carefully in sacks, checked regularly for signs of mice or rot. Apples, if they have any, are kept in the coolest part of the house. Every bit of food that can possibly be saved for later is saved, because come February, her family's survival might depend on that wrinkled apple or that handful of dried peas. But here is where women's ingenuity really shows through. Because medieval women did not just cook for their families, many of them also cooked for profit. They baked bread to sell, they made cheese to sell, they brewed ale to sell. Food production was not just domestic labour, it was business. Let me tell you how bread baking worked in a medieval village. Most peasant houses did not have ovens. Ovens were expensive to build and required a lot of fuel to heat. So many villages had communal ovens, often owned by the lord of the manor or by the church. If you wanted to bake bread, you would prepare your dough at home, let it rise, shape it into loaves, and then carry those loaves to the communal oven. You would pay a small fee, maybe a loaf or two from your batch, or a few pennies, for the privilege of using the oven. This meant that bread baking was a semi-public activity. Women would gather at the oven, chatting while they waited for their loaves to bake, keeping an eye on each other's bread to make sure nothing burned, swapping recipes and tips and gossip. It was a social space, a women's space. Some women became known as particularly good bakers. Their bread was better than others, lighter, more flavourful, more reliable, and these women could sell their bread. We have records of women who ran bakeries essentially making enough bread to supply not just their own families but their neighbours as well. This was skilled work. This was entrepreneurship. The same was true for ale brewing, which we touched on earlier. But let me give you more detail about what this actually involved. Brewing ale required several days of work. First, you had to heat water over the fire, a lot of water, which meant hauling it from the well. Then you added malted grain, usually barley that had been allowed to sprout and then dried. The grain had to be stirred into the hot water and left to steep, creating a sweet liquid called wort. Then you had to cool the wort and add yeast. Then you had to wait while it fermented, checking it regularly to make sure it was progressing properly. After a few days you had ale. But here is the challenging part. You had to sell it quickly, because ale went sour within a few days or a week at most. So ale brewing required not just skill in the brewing itself, but also business sense. You had to time your brewing so that you had ale ready when people wanted to buy it. You had to price it competitively. You had to maintain a reputation for quality, because in a small village, everyone knew whose ale was good and whose was questionable. Women who brewed ale regularly would hang that broom over their door when they had a fresh batch ready. Neighbours would come by with their own jugs or cups, and the brewster would sell them ale by the measure. This was cash in hand. This was income that a woman controlled. And in a society where women had very little financial independence, that mattered. Now, let me tell you about something that might surprise you. The church had a lot to say about when and what people could eat. There were fast days, days when eating meat was forbidden. Fridays were fast days. So was all of Lent, the 40 days before Easter. On those days you could eat fish but not meat. You could eat eggs and cheese but not meat. The rules were quite specific. For wealthy people this was merely an inconvenience. They could afford fish, lots of fish. They could afford fancy dishes made from expensive ingredients that technically complied with the fast day rules. But for peasants, fast days could be genuinely hard. If your main source of protein was the occasional piece of bacon or the rare chicken dinner, and suddenly you are not allowed to eat that, what do you eat instead? More pottage, more bread, more of the same limited diet you were already eating. But here is what is interesting. Despite, or maybe because of these limitations, Medieval women became incredibly creative cooks. They learned how to make the same basic ingredients taste different through various combinations of herbs and cooking methods. They learned how to make a little bit of food go a long way. They learned tricks for making stale bread edible again, soaking it in broth or ale, turning it into a kind of porridge, using it as a thickener for soups. There is a medieval practice called using bread as a trencher. Instead of a plate, you would use a thick slice of stale bread. Your food would be placed on top of this bread, and as you ate, the bread would soak up all the juices and sauces. By the end of the meal, the bread was thoroughly saturated with flavour, and you would eat it too. Nothing wasted. Or sometimes, if you were wealthy, you would give those used trenchers to the poor as alms. Bread that had soaked up the drippings from your roasted meat was a real treat for someone who rarely ate meat. Let me tell you about cheese for a moment, because cheese was important. If you had a cow or a goat, and if that animal was producing more milk than your family could drink fresh, you needed to preserve it somehow. Cheese was the answer. Medieval women knew how to make cheese. They knew that if you added rennet, an enzyme from a calf's stomach, to warm milk and let it sit, the milk would separate into curds and whey. The curds could be pressed and aged, becoming cheese that would last for months. Different regions had different cheese traditions. Some cheeses were soft and fresh, meant to be eaten within days. Others were hard and aged, growing more flavourful over time. Making good cheese was a skill that took practice. You had to know how much rennet to use, what temperature the milk should be, how long to age the cheese, how to keep it from growing the wrong kind of mould. And here is the thing, cheese was not just for eating, it was currency. A woman with a cheese-making skill could trade cheese for other goods. She could sell cheese at market. Cheese represented labour and still turned into something durable and valuable. Catherine, at her hearth, knows all of this. She knows how to make pottage last for days. She knows which wild plants are safe to add for extra nutrition. She knows how to turn milk into cheese, grain into bread, barley into ale. She knows how to stretch a chicken, if they are lucky enough to have one, into multiple meals. Use the meat for one dinner. Make broth from the bones for another. Use that broth as the base for pottage for a third. Medieval women were performing miracles of resource management every single day, taking almost nothing and turning it into something that could sustain life. This was not celebrated. This was not rewarded. This was just expected. Of course, women know how to cook. Of course, they can make food appear on the table. That is just what women do. But it was not simple. It was not easy. It required deep knowledge, constant creativity, and an intimate understanding of nutrition, even if they could not have named the vitamins and minerals they were trying to provide. As Catherine finally ladles pottage into wooden bowls for her family, as they gather around the fire to eat their evening meal, as the same scene repeats in cottage after cottage across the village, we have only scratched the surface of what daily life was like for these women. Because beyond the cooking and the fields and the spinning, there was the reality of home itself, what it was actually like to live in these small, crowded, smoky spaces. And the truth might shock you. Let us step inside one of these cottages and see what home really meant in medieval times. When you think of a medieval home, what comes to mind? Maybe you picture a charming cottage with a thatched roof, flowers growing around the door, smoke curling peacefully from the chimney. It looks cozy in paintings and movies, does it not? Well, let me tell you what it was actually like to live in one of those cottages. And I am warning you now, the reality is going to shatter every romantic notion you have ever had about medieval village life. Walk with me into a typical peasant house. The year is 1320, the village is somewhere in the English countryside, and the family we are visiting has what would be considered a fairly standard dwelling for their class. Ready? Let us push open that wooden door. The first thing that hits you is the smell, smoke obviously, because there is a fire burning in the hearth and there is no chimney, just a hole in the roof that the smoke is supposed to drift out of. Except a lot of it does not drift out. It just hangs in the air, stinging your eyes, coating everything with a fine layer of soot. But there is also the smell of unwashed bodies, because bathing is rare. The smell of the animals that sometimes shelter in here during bad weather. The smell of food cooking or food that has gone slightly off, or the chamber pot in the corner that has not been emptied yet today. Are you still with me? Because it gets more intense. The house is one room, just one, about 20 feet by 15 feet if the family's relatively prosperous, smaller if they are poorer. In this single space everything happens. Cooking, eating, working, sleeping, giving birth, dying. There is no privacy. None. The concept barely exists. The floor is dirt. Packed earth. Maybe with some rushes or straw scattered on top to make it slightly less muddy and cold. In winter it is freezing. In summer it is dusty. When it rains and water seeps in through cracks in the walls or under the door, it turns into mud. And yes, people walk on this floor with their shoes that have been in the animal pens and the fields and the village paths where everyone tosses their waste. The walls are wattle and daub. Do you know what that is? Wattle is woven sticks, basically a basket-like structure. Daub is a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung smeared over the wattle to fill in the gaps. When it dries, it creates a semi-solid wall. Semi-solid. It cracks, it crumbles. Wind whistles through the gaps. Rain can wash parts of it away. And maintaining these walls is constant work. Remember Aldusa Chaplian from Elton back in 1306? She got in trouble with the manorial court because she had not kept her dwelling house in proper repair. The court records say she had to find people who would guarantee that she would, before the next court, repair her dwelling house in as good a condition as she received it. This was not a suggestion. This was the law. If you did not maintain your house, you faced fines, and it was expensive to maintain. Thatch for the roof needed replacing regularly, every 10 or 15 years if you were lucky, sooner if storms damaged it. Daub needed patching. The wooden frame needed repairs when timbers rotted. All of this cost money or required labour that the family could barely spare. So let us talk about the inside of this house. The centrepiece is the hearth, the fireplace, though calling it a fireplace is generous. It is really just a designated spot on the dirt floor where you build your fire. Maybe there are some stones arranged to contain it. Maybe there is not even that. The fire is never fully extinguished, because starting it again is too much work. So all night there are glowing embers. All day there is smoke. Above the hearth, probably hanging from a hook or a chain, is the pottage pot that we talked about earlier. Around the hearth are a few basic cooking implements, maybe a second pot, a few wooden spoons, perhaps a knife or two. That is it, no cupboards full of kitchen gadgets. No stove with multiple burners, just fire and a pot and whatever you can make work. Now where does the family sleep on the floor? They have pallets, basically mattresses made of cloth stuffed with straw. During the day these might be rolled up and pushed against the wall. At night they are laid out on the floor. The husband and wife share one. The children might share others, or they might just huddle together in the straw. Some houses, the slightly better ones, have a loft. There might be a ladder leading up to a small platform built at one end of the room just below the rafters. This loft provides a tiny bit of extra sleeping space, usually for children or for storing things, but it is dark up there and smoky, and in winter it is not much warmer than being outside. The husband and wife have a bed. Well, a shared pallet anyway. And sometimes the baby sleeps with them, nestled between their bodies for warmth. Other times there is a cradle by the fire, just a wooden box really, maybe with rockers so it can be rocked back and forth to soothe a fussy baby. You set the cradle close to the fire because babies need to be kept warm, but not so close that a spark could set the whole thing ablaze. It is a delicate balance, and the coroner's rolls tell us that sometimes people got it wrong. Let me tell you about the furniture, because there is not much. Maybe a rough wooden table, maybe a bench or two, perhaps a chest for storing the family's few possessions, extra clothes, important documents if they have any, small treasures. That is about it. No chairs, no dressers, no bookshelves, obviously, because peasants do not own books. Most of them cannot read anyway. Everything the family owns is in this one room. Cooking equipment, tools for spinning and weaving, agricultural tools leaning in a corner, bags of grain, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, perhaps a piece of salted meat wrapped in cloth, clothes hung on pegs on the wall, the whole of their material life compressed into this tiny, smoky, crowded space. Now let us talk about something that nobody really wants to discuss, but we need to address. Bathroom facilities, or rather, the complete lack thereof. There are no bathrooms, there are no toilets, there is no running water. So what did people do? Well, they had chamber pots, basically buckets kept inside the house for nighttime use. During the day, you went outside to a designated area, probably just a hole dug in the ground, or you went in the fields or woods. And what about washing, personal hygiene? Here is where things get really interesting. Medieval people did not bathe often. We're not talking about showering every day or even every week. We are talking about maybe a few times a year, if that. When they did bathe, they used a barrel with the top cut off, filled with water that had to be carried from the well and heated over the fire. And to save effort, families would bathe one after another in the same water. Father first, then mother, then the children in order of age. By the time the youngest child got in, that water was, well, let us just say it was no longer very clean. Does this shock you? It should. But here is the thing. Medieval people did not understand the connection between cleanliness and disease. They did not know about germs or bacteria, so from their perspective, bathing too much was actually dangerous. They thought it opened up your pores and let illness in. They thought cold water could make you sick, so they avoided bathing not out of laziness, but out of a misguided attempt to stay healthy. Instead of bathing, people would wash their hands and face regularly. They would change their undergarments, linen shirts and shifts that absorbed sweat, and could be washed more easily than outer clothes. But full-body bathing? Rare! Let me paint you a picture of a typical night in this house. It is winter, so it gets dark early. By about 4 or 5 in the afternoon, the family has finished their evening meal. There is no artificial light except the fire. Candles are expensive, made from tallow, animal fat, and they smell terrible when they burn. So most peasant families just live by the light of the fire once the sun goes down. What do they do with all that time between sunset and sleep? Well, they might do some light work. Women might spin or mend clothes, sitting close to the fire to see what they are doing. Men might repair tools or carve wooden objects, but mostly they just sit and talk, tell stories, sing songs, go to bed early, because there is not much else to do and sleep is free. The whole family sleeps in this one room, the parents, the children, the baby in the cradle. If a grandparent lives with them, which is not uncommon, they are in here too. Everyone can hear everything, every snore, every cough, every intimate moment between husband and wife, every cry when the baby needs feeding, every child having a nightmare. There is no escape. There is no privacy, there is no quiet space where you can be alone with your thoughts. Can you imagine living like this? And I am not asking that in a judgmental way. I am genuinely asking, can you imagine? Your entire life contained in a space smaller than most modern bedrooms. Your entire family sleeping within arm's reach of each other. The constant smoke, the cold, the dirt, the smell, day after day, year after year, your whole life. And yet people did live like this, millions of people for hundreds of years. They were born in these houses, they grew up in them, they raised their own children in them, they grew old and died in them. These small, humble, uncomfortable spaces were home. This was normal. This was life. But here is what I want you to understand. As harsh as these conditions were, as uncomfortable as they seemed to us, there was still warmth in these homes. Not just from the fire, but from the people. There was love. There was laughter. There were families who cared for each other, who worked together, who found joy in small things, a good meal, a sleeping baby, a story told by the fire, the satisfaction of a day's work done. Medieval people were not miserable all the time, they were not constantly wishing they lived in a different era. This was their normal, and they found ways to make it bearable, even meaningful. They celebrated births and mourned deaths. They fell in love and raised children. They had hopes and dreams and fears and joys just like we do. The difference is the setting, the material conditions, the physical hardships that shaped every single day of their lives. And when we talk about medieval women in particular, we need to remember that they were not just dealing with these conditions. They were responsible for managing them. Women were the ones who had to keep the fire going, keep the house clean enough to be livable, keep the smoke from getting too bad, keep the children from falling into the fire, or eating something poisonous or wandering off and getting hurt. Women were household managers in the most literal sense. They managed life and death in that tiny smoky room. They brought babies into the world there, nursed them, raised them. They nursed sick children back to health when they could, and held them as they died when they could not. They laid out the bodies of family members who passed away, washing them, preparing them for burial. That one room was the entire theatre of domestic life, and women were at the centre of it, always working, always vigilant, always responsible for keeping everything from falling apart. But as hard as domestic life was, there was another force that shaped every single day in a medieval village. Something that regulated time, dictated behaviour, provided structure and meaning and community. The church bells are ringing, calling people to prayer, marking the hours of the day. And in that sound, in the shadow of the church tower, in the rhythms of the religious calendar, we find another crucial piece of what life was like for medieval women. Let us follow the sound of those bells and discover how deeply religion was woven into the fabric of daily life. The bells ring out across the village just as the first light of dawn touches the horizon. This is not a gentle suggestion that you might want to wake up. This is a command. The church bells are telling you that it is time for matins, the first prayer service of the day. And if you are a medieval villager, you do not get to roll over and go back to sleep. The church is not optional. The church is everything. Let me tell you something that might surprise you. In medieval Europe, the church was not just a place you visited on Sundays for an hour of worship before going about your week. The church was the organizing principle of your entire existence. It told you when to wake up, when to work, when to rest, when to fast, when to feast, when to marry, when to mourn. The rhythm of your life was the rhythm of the church calendar, and there was no escaping it. For women in particular, the church was a complicated presence. On one hand, it provided structure, community, and moments of genuine spiritual comfort. On the other hand, it reinforced the idea that women were inherently lesser than men, that they were the daughters of Eve who had brought sin into the world, and that their suffering was deserved punishment for that original transgression. Let me introduce you to a woman named Isabel. It is a Sunday morning in spring, and Isabel is getting her family ready for Mass. She has already been up for 2 hours, the fire is lit, breakfast has been eaten, the animals have been fed. Now she makes sure her children's faces are washed, their clothes are as clean as they can be, their hair is combed. Her husband is ready, and Isabel herself puts on her best dress, which is not much different from her everyday dress, but at least it has been recently washed and mended, and covers her hair with a wimple, because a married woman must always have her head covered, especially in church. The church bells are still ringing as the family walks down the village path toward the stone building that dominates the landscape. The church is the largest structure in the village, the most impressive building most of these people will ever see. It has stone walls, glass windows, a tower that rises high into the sky. Inside there are paintings on the walls, maybe some carved decorations, an altar draped with cloth. For peasants who live in one-room cottages with dirt floors, stepping into the church is like entering another world. Mass is conducted entirely in Latin. Isabel does not understand Latin, neither does her husband. Neither do most of the people crowded into the church. The priest chants words that are incomprehensible to them, performs rituals that are mysterious, holds up the consecrated bread and wine that they believe has literally become the body and blood of Christ. They cannot participate in any meaningful way. They cannot read the Bible, which is written in Latin and kept chained to the altar anyway. They can only watch and try to follow along. But here is the thing, even though they do not understand the words, even though they are passive observers in their own worship, the church service provides something important. It provides community. Everyone in the village is here, crowded together, sharing this experience. Rich and poor, young and old, they are all standing in the same space, all supposedly equal before God, even if that equality disappears the moment they step back outside. The church calendar shaped medieval life in ways that are hard for us to comprehend today. Let me walk you through the year in the life of Isabel and her community, as organized by the church. The year begins with Christmas, though medieval people did not make quite as big a deal out of Christmas as we do today. It was important, certainly, the celebration of Christ's birth, but it was not the commercial extravaganza it has become. There would be special masses, perhaps some better food if the family could afford it, a day of rest from labour. Then comes Epiphany in January, marking when the wise men visited the baby Jesus. February brings Candlemas, a feast celebrating the purification of Mary. And then Lent begins, and here is where things get serious. Lent is 40 days of fasting before Easter. Now, when medieval people said fasting, they did not mean eating nothing. They meant giving up certain foods, particularly meat, eggs, and dairy products. For wealthy people, this meant eating a lot of fish instead. For peasants like Isabel's family, it meant eating an even more limited diet than usual. More pottage, more bread, more beans, for 40 days. Can you imagine? Your diet is already barely adequate. You're already going hungry more often than not. And now, for religious reasons, you have to give up the few sources of protein and fat that you occasionally have access to. This was not easy. This was genuinely hard, but it was required. The church said so and you obeyed. Easter finally arrives, breaking the fast, and it is a huge celebration. The most important feast day of the entire year. There would be special foods if possible. Eggs that had been given up during Lent could be eaten again. Maybe, if the family was lucky, there would be some meat. There would be music and games and a general sense of relief that Lent was over. Spring continues with Rogation Days, when the entire village would walk the boundaries of their land in a formal procession. This was partly religious ritual and partly practical. It reinforced everyone's memory of where the village lands began and ended, which was important in an era before accurate maps. Women and men, children and elderly, all walking together, marking their territory, blessing their fields. Then comes Whitsunday, also called Pentecost, celebrating the descent of the Holy Spirit. This brought another week of vacation from labour service for most villeins, the peasants who owed work to the Lord. Can you hear how the church calendar provided the only breaks from constant labour? There were no weekends. There were no paid vacation days. There were only holy days, holidays, when work was forbidden because the church said you must rest and pray. Summer brings the feast of St. John the Baptist on June 24th. This is midsummer, the longest day of the year, and it was marked with bonfires lit on hilltops. Young men would carry burning brands and wave them around to drive away dragons, which obviously were not real, but the tradition was old and nobody questioned it. A fiery wheel might be rolled down a hill, symbolizing the sun reaching its highest point and beginning its descent toward winter again. August brings Lammas, marking the end of the hay harvest and the beginning of the grain harvest. The name comes from loaf mass. The first loaves of bread made from the new wheat would be brought to church and blessed. This was the beginning of the most intense work period of the year, when everyone would be labouring in the fields from dawn to dusk to bring in the harvest before the weather turned. Autumn continues with Michaelmas in late September, another important feast day, and then All Saints' Day in November, followed immediately by All Souls' Day when people would pray for the dead and remember those who had passed. This was a sombre time, the beginning of winter, when death felt very close. Do you see the pattern here? The church calendar provided the framework for the entire year. It told people when to work and when to rest, when to fast and when to feast, when to be solemn and when to celebrate. For medieval villagers who had no calendars in their homes, who could not read or write, who had no other way of marking time, the church bells and the feast days were how they knew where they were in the year. For women, the church's influence went even deeper. The church taught that women were weak, sinful, and in need of male authority. Women were the spiritual daughters of Eve, who had been tempted by the serpent and caused humanity's fall from grace. This was constantly reinforced. Women were told they must obey their husbands, must cover their heads, must be modest and submissive and quiet. But here is the fascinating contradiction. The church also venerated Mary, the mother of Jesus. Mary was held up as the ideal woman, pure, obedient, devoted to her son, and ultimately powerful as the Queen of Heaven. Medieval women prayed to Mary constantly. When Isabel's child was sick, she would light a candle to Mary and pray for intercession. When she was in labour, terrified and in pain, she would pray to Mary, who understood the pain of motherhood. There is something powerful in this, actually. Yes, the church taught that women were lesser, but it also taught that a woman, Mary, was the mother of God himself. A woman's body had carried divinity. A woman had been chosen for the most important role in all of salvation history. This gave medieval women a kind of spiritual authority, a sense that their suffering and their strength mattered on a cosmic level. And then there were the female saints, women who had lived extraordinary lives, who had performed miracles, who were now in heaven, interceding for those who prayed to them. Saint Margaret, patron saint of childbirth; Saint Catherine, patron saint of girls and students; Saint Agnes, virgin martyr. These women provided role models, examples of female strength and devotion. Let me tell you about another aspect of church life that mattered deeply to women: the cemetery, which medieval people called the coematerium, from the Latin word for dormitory, a sleeping place. This was where the dead were laid to rest, always in the churchyard, always in consecrated ground, always facing east toward the rising sun and the promised resurrection. When someone in Isabel's family dies, and in medieval times someone is always dying, the women prepare the body. They wash it. They dress it in clean clothes or wrap it in a shroud. They lay it out. They keep vigil through the night, praying, making sure the body is not left alone. This is women's work, this intimate care of the dead, and it is considered sacred. The burial is simple: a plain wooden casket, if the family can afford one, often just the body wrapped in cloth. a grave dug in the churchyard, a few prayers, and then the person is laid to rest in that sleeping place, waiting for the day of resurrection when, according to church teaching, all the dead will rise and their toil will finally be finished. Isabel stands at these gravesides often. She has buried 2 of her children already. One died as an infant, another at age 5 from a fever that would not break. She has helped prepare the bodies of neighbours, of her own mother, of the old woman who lived down the lane and had no family left to care for her. Death is so common, so constant, that the churchyard is always being dug up for new graves. But the church provides a framework for grief. It tells Isabel that her children are with God now, safe in heaven, no longer suffering. It tells her that death is not the end, that there will be a resurrection, that families will be reunited. Whether or not you believe this, you have to admit it provides comfort. In a world of constant loss, the promise of eternal life and heavenly reunion was not just spiritual, it was psychological survival. Now, let me tell you about one church tradition that really shows the relationship between religion and village life. Remember Hocktide, which came in Easter week? This was a tradition where, on the first day, the young women of the village would playfully hold the young men prisoner until they paid a fine, usually just a few pennies. On the second day, the men would do the same to the women. This was not serious. This was festive, flirtatious, fun. The money collected would go to the church. Can you imagine this? In a society that normally kept young unmarried men and women fairly separate, in a society that was strict about moral behaviour, here was a sanctioned opportunity for playful interaction, for laughter, for young people to notice each other. The church allowed this. The church even benefited from it financially. It recognized that people needed moments of joy, of release, of play. Or consider May Day, when young people would go into the woods to gather flowering branches to decorate their homes. Sometimes they would stay out all night in the woods. You can imagine what probably happened during those all-night stays in the forest. The church officially frowned on this, of course, but unofficially everyone knew it happened and more or less turned a blind eye. Because humans are humans, and young people are going to find ways to be young people no matter what the rules say. The church shaped village life, but village life also shaped how the church was actually practiced. There was the official version, the Latin masses, the fasting rules, the moral teachings. And then there was the reality, the traditions that blended pagan customs with Christian observance, the moments of joy and celebration that the church had learned to incorporate rather than trying to stamp out the practical accommodations made for human nature. For Isabel, the church is complicated. It is the source of her greatest comfort when she kneels before the statue of Mary and prays for her family. It is also the source of some of her greatest burdens when she is told that her suffering is deserved, that her work is never quite enough, that as a woman she is inherently lesser. But it is the only church she knows, the only spiritual system available to her, and she finds meaning in it despite its contradictions. As the Mass ends and Isabel and her family file out of the church into the spring sunshine, as the bells ring out marking the transition from sacred time to work time, there is another world we need to explore. Because villages were not isolated units where everyone just worked and prayed alone. They were communities, bound together by necessity and by choice, by friendship and by conflict. And in that web of community relationships, women played roles that history has barely acknowledged. Let us step into the messy, complicated, absolutely essential reality of how villages actually functioned as communities. Imagine living in a place where everyone knows your business. I mean everyone. They know when you wake up because they hear your door open. They know what you cooked for dinner because they can smell it. They know when you and your husband have an argument because the walls are thin and voices carry. They know if you are pregnant before you tell anyone because they notice the changes in your body. There is no anonymity, there is no privacy, there is no escaping the constant attention of your neighbours. This is village life, and surprisingly it is what kept people alive. Let me tell you about a woman named Alice. She lives in a village of maybe 200 people, which means she knows every single person by name. She knows their families, she knows their histories, she knows who is trustworthy, and who tends to borrow things and never return them. She knows who brews the best ale, and who gossips too much, and who can be relied on in a crisis. This morning, Alice wakes up to discover that her cow is sick. This is a disaster. The cow provides milk, which her family drinks and which she makes into cheese to sell. Without the cow's milk, they will lose a significant portion of their income. She cannot afford a veterinarian, because veterinarians as we know them do not exist. So what does she do? She goes to her neighbour, Margaret, who is known throughout the village for her knowledge of animal ailments. Margaret comes over, examines the cow, and tells Alice to try a particular herbal remedy. Alice does not have those herbs, but she knows that the woman who lives 3 houses down grows them in her garden. She walks over and asks if she can have some. The woman agrees, but mentions that she will need help next week fixing her roof where some thatch has come loose. Alice agrees. A few days later, the cow is better. Crisis averted. Do you see what just happened there? That is a community economy in action. No money changed hands, but value was exchanged, knowledge was shared, help was given, and will be returned. This is how medieval villages functioned, not through formal institutions, but through an intricate web of obligations, favours, and mutual support. Women were absolutely central to these networks. In fact, in many ways, women were the glue that held village communities together. Let me explain why. First, women spent more time in and around the village than men did. Men might be out in the distant fields all day, or travelling to market in a nearby town, or away performing labour service for the Lord. But women were home more often, working in their gardens, pinning outside doors, cooking over their hearths. This meant they had more opportunities for daily interaction with other women. They could chat while fetching water from the well. They could gossip while working together at the communal oven. They could share information, advice, and support. Second, women needed each other in ways that men did not. Childbirth, as we have discussed, was a female ritual. When a woman went into labour, she needed other women around her. Not just the midwife, but friends, relatives, neighbours. These bonds formed during births were powerful. If you had attended someone's labour, held their hand through the pain, helped bring their child into the world, you had a connection that went deep. The same was true for nursing the sick. If your child had a fever, if your husband had injured himself in the fields, if your elderly mother was declining, you needed help, and that help came from other women. They would bring food. They would sit with the sick person so you could rest. They would share remedies and prayers and comfort. And when someone died, women prepared the body together. This was intimate work, sacred work, and it created bonds. If you had washed and dressed the body of someone's child, if you had helped them through the worst moment of their life, you were bound to them in a way that words cannot quite capture. Let me tell you about a practice that shows just how interconnected these women's lives were. The brewing of ale, which we have talked about before, happened on a rotating basis in many villages. One week, Alice might brew a large batch of ale and hang the broom over her door. Her neighbours would come buy ale from her, bringing their own jugs or cups. The next week, it might be Margaret's turn to brew and sell. The week after that, someone else. This system made sense for several reasons. Ale did not keep well, so you could not brew a huge amount and expect to sell it over weeks. But brewing required time and fuel and equipment, so you wanted to make a large enough batch to be worth the effort. The solution? Take turns. Each woman would brew when it was her turn, make enough to supply the whole village for a few days, and everyone would rotate through. But here is what is interesting. This system required trust and cooperation. If someone brewed bad ale, if they watered it down to make more profit, if they charged too much, word would spread immediately. Reputation mattered enormously. Your neighbours were also your customers, and if they decided you were cheating them, your business would collapse. There were even official positions in medieval villages whose job it was to check the quality of ale. These were called alatasters, and yes, it is exactly what it sounds like. An alataster would go around tasting people's ale to make sure it met quality standards. In some villages, the alataster would sit on a wooden bench while wearing leather pants, pour ale on the bench, and then tip it. If the ale was good, the leather would not stick. If the ale had too much sugar in it, a sign that the brewer had added extra ingredients to increase the volume, the leather would stick to the bench. It is hard to know if this method actually worked, but the point is that communities took ale quality seriously. Now, let us talk about something that might make you uncomfortable: village justice. When someone broke the rules, and there were many rules, the community had ways of dealing with it. The manorial court would meet regularly, presided over by the Lord Steward or the bailiff, and villagers would bring their complaints. Women appeared in these courts all the time. We have extensive records of this. Women were fined for brewing bad ale. Women were fined for not keeping their houses in good repair. Women were fined for letting their animals wander onto someone else's land. Women brought charges against others for theft, for assault, for breach of contract. Let me give you a specific example. In Elton, in the year 1300, a woman appeared in court because her chickens had gotten into someone's garden and destroyed vegetables. She was fined a few pennies. In 1312, two women appeared in court to settle a dispute about a debt. One had borrowed money and had not paid it back. The court ordered her to pay, plus a small fine for the trouble. These were not major crimes. These were the everyday conflicts that arise when people live in close quarters and have to share resources, and the court system, crude as it was, provided a way to resolve these conflicts without violence, usually. Because here is the thing, village life was not always peaceful. People fought, they argued, they held grudges. Sometimes those grudges turned violent. The coroner's rolls that we have mentioned before are full of cases of neighbours attacking each other, of disputes that escalated from words to blows. Women were both victims and perpetrators in these conflicts. We have records of women hitting each other with whatever was at hand, a stick, a pot, a rock. We have records of women verbally abusing each other, calling each other names that I probably should not repeat in a family-friendly video. We have records of women forming alliances against other women, using social pressure and gossip as weapons. This might shatter some romantic notions you have about medieval villages. We like to imagine them as cosy, supportive communities where everyone helped each other. And they were that, sometimes. But they were also places of intense social pressure, of constant surveillance, of petty conflicts blown out of proportion because there was no escape from each other. If you had a falling out with your neighbour, you still had to see them every single day. You still had to live 3 houses down from them. You still had to share the communal oven and the village well and the church pews. There was no moving to another neighbourhood. There was no blocking someone on social media. You had to find a way to coexist, even if you hated each other. Now, let me tell you about one of the most interesting aspects of village community life: the communal work practices. We have touched on this before with harvest boons, but there were many other examples. Ploughing was often done cooperatively. Peasants who owned oxen would pool them together into a plough team because you needed multiple oxen to pull a heavy plough through the clay-heavy soils of England. If you only had 1 or 2 oxen, you would work with your neighbours who also had 1 or 2, and together you would have enough. The same was true for haymaking. Hay had to be cut, dried, and gathered into stacks quickly before rain could ruin it. This was all hands-on-deck work. Men and women, young and old, everyone working together. And then, when the hay was safely stored, there would be a celebration. Not a huge feast, but perhaps some ale, some bread and cheese, some singing and laughter. These moments of communal celebration were important. They reinforced social bonds. They reminded people that they were part of something larger than just their individual families. They created memories of joy and togetherness that could sustain people through the harder times. Let me tell you about something that historians have debated extensively. Did medieval villages have a strong sense of community solidarity, or were they fractured and competitive? And the answer is both. It depended on the village, on the time period, on the specific circumstances. Some historians, like Miriam Muller, have argued that economic stress, changing inheritance practices, and class tensions fractured village solidarity. As some families became wealthier and others became poorer, as the gap between the prosperous peasants and the struggling ones widened, the sense of "we are all in this together" eroded. People started seeing each other more as competitors than as community members. But other historians have pointed out that despite these tensions, villages still needed each other. You could not harvest the grain alone. You could not maintain the roads and bridges alone. You could not defend against bandits or wild animals alone. So even if there was a resentment, even if there was competition, there still had to be cooperation. The communal buildings, the church, the shared lands, the harvest customs, these things kept binding people together even when other forces tried to pull them apart. For women, this tension was particularly acute. On one hand, women absolutely needed their female neighbours. They needed help with childbirth, with childcare, with household emergencies. They needed to borrow tools and ingredients. They needed emotional support and practical assistance, so they cultivated these relationships carefully. On the other hand, women were also in competition with each other. If you were brewing ale to sell, every customer who bought from your neighbour was a customer you had lost. If you were a midwife, you wanted women to call on you, not on the other midwife in the village. If your family was trying to marry off a daughter, you wanted her to make a better match than your neighbour's daughter. This created a complex social dynamic. Women were simultaneously allies and rivals, friends and competitors. They had to navigate this carefully, maintaining good relationships while also looking out for their own interests. Alice, standing at her door on a summer evening, watching her neighbours go about their business, knows all of this instinctively. She knows that Margaret helped her with the cow, and she will help Margaret with the roof. She knows that the woman down the lane is jealous because Alice's ale sells better than hers. She knows that she needs to stay on good terms with everyone because she might need any one of them at any moment. She knows that gossip can destroy a reputation, so she is careful about what she says and does. She knows that in a village this small, one misstep can have consequences that last for years. This is the reality of village community life. Not a simple story of either perfect harmony or constant conflict, but something more complicated. A web of relationships that was sometimes supportive, sometimes competitive, always intense, and absolutely necessary for survival. As the sun sets and families retreat into their cottages for the evening, as the village settles into that brief quiet before tomorrow's work begins again, we have covered so much ground. We have walked through the smoke-filled houses and the golden fields, through the birthing rooms and the churches, through the cycles of planting and harvest, prayer and work, birth and death. But there is one more crucial thing we need to understand, because the story of medieval village women is not just about how they lived. It is also about how they have been forgotten, how their work became invisible, how history almost lost them completely, and how we are only now beginning to recover the truth about who they were and what they contributed. This is where everything comes together, where the hidden becomes visible, and where we finally give these women the recognition they deserved all along. Here is something that should make you angry. For hundreds of years, centuries, historians wrote books about the Middle Ages and barely mentioned women. They wrote about kings and wars and political intrigue. They wrote about knights and crusades and the rise and fall of empires. They wrote about trade and agriculture and technological innovation. But when it came to the women who made up half the population, who did essential work every single day, who literally kept society functioning, silence, or worse, dismissal. Let me read you something that a medieval scholar named Eileen Power wrote back in the early 20th century. She said that when it comes to women's history in the Middle Ages, we face the problem of silence. Women's voices were not recorded, their work was not documented, their lives were not considered worth writing about. And this silence has been mistaken for absence. Historians looked at the historical record, saw that it mostly talked about men, and concluded that men must have been the only people doing anything important. But here is the truth that modern historians are finally uncovering. The silence was not because women were not there. The silence was because nobody bothered to write about them. Or more accurately, the people who did write about them, the monks copying manuscripts, the clerics keeping records, the male chroniclers documenting their times, did not think women's work mattered enough to record in detail. Think about this for a moment. We have incredibly detailed records about how much grain was harvested in a particular manner in a particular year. We have records of how many sheep were sheared and how much wool was produced. We have records of fines paid in manorial courts and taxes collected and land transfers. Medieval people were obsessive record keepers when it came to things that involved money or property or legal obligations. But women's work, that was just background. That was assumed. That was so normal and constant that it became invisible. A woman spinning wool was like the air you breathe, essential to life but not something you comment on or write down or celebrate. Let me tell you about a quote that I find both beautiful and heartbreaking. There is a historian named Marianne Kowaleski who studied medieval women's work extensively, and she discovered this description of women's labour. Women everywhere tended their children, milked their cattle, tilled their fields, washed, baked, cleaned and sewed, healed the sick, sat by the dying and laid out the dead. Read that list again. Tended their children, milked their cattle, tilled their fields, washed, baked, cleaned and sewed, healed the sick, sat by the dying and laid out the dead. That is the entire life cycle from birth to death with women at every stage. And then Kowaleski adds this crucial observation. The extraordinary continuity of women's work from country to country and age to age is one of the reasons for its invisibility. The sight of a woman nursing a baby, stirring a cook pot or cleaning a floor is as natural as the air we breathe. Do you understand what she is saying? Women's work was so universal, so constant, so fundamental to human existence that it became invisible. Nobody wrote about it because it was everywhere. It was like trying to write about gravity or time, so basic to reality that it did not seem worth documenting. But here is where it gets even more frustrating. When medieval writers did mention women's work, they often dismissed it. There are texts from the period that basically say, well, women do housework and help in the fields a bit, but the real work is done by men. The implication was that women's contributions were minor, supplemental, not really economically significant. This was a lie, a complete and total lie. But it was a lie that got repeated for centuries, and it shaped how we understood medieval life. Even into the 20th century, history textbooks would talk about medieval agriculture and show pictures of men ploughing and harvesting, with maybe a woman in the background somewhere. The narrative was that men were the farmers, the workers, the economic producers. Women were just there, helping, supporting, but not really doing anything crucial. It was not until the late 20th century, really, starting in the 1970s and 1980s, that historians began to seriously challenge this narrative. And you know how they did it? By looking at sources that previous historians had ignored. They looked at manorial court records, which documented all the fines and disputes and transactions in medieval villages. And in those records they found women brewing ale, women running farms, women appearing in court, women buying and selling goods, women everywhere doing everything. They looked at coroners' rolls, those detailed records of accidental deaths, and they found women working in brewhouses and fields and workshops, dying in workplace accidents, just like men did, which proved they were doing the same kind of labour. They looked at tax records, which listed people's occupations, and they found women in dozens of different trades. Women working as bakers, brewers, butchers, fishmongers, spice dealers, textile workers, innkeepers, shopkeepers, and more. They looked at wills and inventories, which listed people's possessions at death. And they found women owning tools and equipment for various trades, owning animals and land, leaving inheritances to their children. They looked at guild records in cities like Paris and London, and they found something shocking. In Paris in the 1300s, women were working in more than 100 different trades. 100. Some of these trades were dominated by women, others had both men and women, but women were everywhere in the urban economy. Let me give you a specific example that really drives this home. There was a historian named Judith Bennett who spent years studying the brewing industry in medieval England. She discovered that in the early Middle Ages, brewing was almost entirely women's work. Women brewed the ale that everyone drank. Women sold that ale. Women controlled that industry. But she also discovered something disturbing. Over time, as brewing became more profitable and more commercialized, men started taking it over. By 1420 in London, only 20 out of 300 registered brewers were female. 20 out of 300. What happened? Did women suddenly forget how to brew? Did they lose interest? No, they were pushed out. As soon as an industry became lucrative enough, men moved in and women were excluded, often through guild regulations that made it difficult or impossible for women to practice the trade officially. This pattern repeated itself across multiple industries. Women dominated textile work, particularly spinning. But weaving, which was higher status and better paid, became increasingly male-dominated. Women worked in food preparation and sales, but as these became more formalized and regulated, men took control. Women were skilled in many crafts, but guilds often restricted their membership to men, or only allowed women to participate through their husbands or fathers. So here is what actually happened. Women were doing essential economic work throughout the Middle Ages, but as that work became more valuable, more formalized, more documented, they were systematically excluded from it. And then, when historians looked back at the formal records, the guild memberships, the business licenses, the tax rolls that listed official occupations, they saw mostly men, and they concluded that men must have been doing most of the work. But if you look at the informal economy, at the work that was not officially licensed or guild regulated, you find women everywhere. And here is the thing, the informal economy was huge. Most people in medieval times were not members of guilds. Most work was not officially licensed. Most economic activity happened outside the formal structures that historians used to study medieval life. A woman named Barbara Hannawalt, who is one of the most important medieval historians of the 20th century, studied peasant life in England extensively. She looked at those coroners' rolls and court records and tax documents, and she built up a detailed picture of what daily life was actually like. And she found that women were absolutely central to the medieval economy. Women's work was not supplemental, it was essential. She wrote a book called The Ties That Bound, peasant families in medieval England, and in it she demonstrated that women and men worked in partnership with overlapping responsibilities and shared economic goals. Yes, there was division of labour. Some tasks were more likely to be done by men, others by women. But the idea that men worked and women just kept house, that was nonsense. Both men and women worked constantly, and their labour was interdependent. Let me tell you about another historian who changed how we understand medieval women. Her name is Marjorie Kenniston Mackintosh, and she wrote a book called Working Women in English Society, 1300 to 1620. In this book, she documented in extraordinary detail the range of work that women did. Money lending, producing and selling goods, brewing and selling ale, working in food trades, running inns, skilled crafts. Women were economic actors, business owners, skilled workers. Most of the money they earned was modest. Most women were not getting rich from their work, but it was real income that made a real difference to their family's survival. And more than that, it was economic agency. It was women controlling at least some aspect of their lives, making decisions, engaging with the market economy. Why did historians miss this for so long? Well, partly it is because they were not looking for it. If you assume that women's work does not matter, you do not look for evidence of it. You do not ask the questions that would reveal it. You do not examine the sources that would document it. But there is also a deeper problem. The sources we have are biased. They were created by men mostly, and they reflect male perspectives and male priorities. The chroniclers who wrote about political events were men. The monks who copied manuscripts were men. The officials who kept records were men, and they wrote about what mattered to them, which often did not include the daily work of women. So we have to read between the lines. We have to look at what is not said as much as what is said. We have to piece together evidence from multiple sources and build up a picture indirectly. It is detective work, essentially, and it is work that is still ongoing. Every year, new studies come out that add to our understanding of medieval women's lives. New sources are discovered. Old sources are re-examined with new questions in mind. And slowly, painstakingly, we are recovering the truth. But here is what makes me sad. For every woman whose name we can recover from the historical record, every Marjorie the widow, every Aldusa Chaplain, every Denise Marlaire, there are thousands whose names are lost forever. They lived, they worked, they suffered and loved and raised children and died, but we will never know their names. We will never know their stories. They have been erased from history as thoroughly as if they never existed. Except we know they did exist. We know they were there, spinning and brewing and harvesting and birthing and nursing and cooking and cleaning and managing households and running farms and keeping their families alive. We know they were there because society could not have functioned without them. The math does not work otherwise. Think about it. If men were doing all the agricultural work and all the craft work and all the economic production, when would they have time to also cook and clean and spin wool and make clothes and raise children and nurse the sick and prepare the dead? They could not do it all. Women were doing half or more of the total labour required to keep medieval society running. So when we talk about the Middle Ages, when we talk about how villages functioned and how the economy worked and how people survived, we have to include women. We have to acknowledge their work. We have to recognise their contributions, not as a favour to them, but because it is the truth. Because anything else is a lie. And here is the most powerful thing about finally recovering this truth. It changes everything. It changes how we think about the medieval economy. It changes how we think about gender roles. It changes how we think about what work is and what counts as productive labour. It challenges the idea that there is men's work and women's work, and that men's work is more important. Because when you actually look at what women were doing, you realise they were doing everything. And calling it women's work did not make it less essential, it just made it invisible. As we stand here centuries later looking back at these medieval villages and the women who lived in them, we owe them something. We owe them recognition. We owe them the truth. We owe them the acknowledgement that they were not background characters in someone else's story. They were the story. Their work, their knowledge, their strength, their resilience, that was what held the medieval world together. And now, finally, we are beginning to see it. But seeing it is not enough. We have to change how we tell the story, and that is what brings us to our final chapter. The lessons these women can teach us, the truths they have to offer, and why their story matters not just for understanding the past, but for thinking about the present and the future. So what do we do with this knowledge? What does it mean that women in medieval villages worked from before dawn until after dark, that they managed households and fields and businesses, that they possessed deep knowledge of healing and cooking and textile production, that they kept their families and communities alive through skill and strength and sheer determination? Why does any of this matter today, in our modern world with its electricity and indoor plumbing and hospitals and grocery stores? Let me tell you why it matters. Because the same pattern that made medieval women's work invisible is still operating today. Think about it. When we talk about important work in our society, what do we think of? We think of jobs that are paid well, that have titles and prestige, that get celebrated and recognized. We think of CEOs and doctors and lawyers and engineers. We think of work that happens in offices and boardrooms and laboratories. That is the work that gets counted, that gets valued, that gets seen. But what about the work of raising children? What about the work of caring for elderly parents? What about the work of maintaining a household, cooking meals, managing schedules, keeping track of everything that needs to be done? What about the emotional labor of maintaining relationships, remembering birthdays, organizing family gatherings, providing support during difficult times? This work is essential, absolutely essential. Without it, families would fall apart, children would not be raised, elderly people would suffer, the basic fabric of daily life would unravel. And yet when this work is unpaid, when it is done at home rather than in a workplace, when it is done by women, it becomes invisible. Just like medieval women's work. We have made progress, certainly. We recognize now that domestic labor is real work. We have concepts like unpaid care work that economists try to measure and value. We understand that when someone stays home to raise children, they are making a genuine economic contribution even if they are not earning paycheck. But we still do not fully value this work. We still act like paid employment is real work and unpaid domestic labour is just what people do. We still pay poverty wages to people who do care work professionally. Childcare workers, home health aides, elder care providers. We still expect mothers to do the majority of housework and childcare on top of their paid jobs. We still have a culture that says some work matters and some work is just expected. Does this sound familiar? It should, because it is the exact same pattern that we saw in medieval villages. Men's work gets documented, valued, paid better. Women's work is essential but invisible, expected but uncompensated, constant but dismissed as just what women do. Let me give you a specific example that really drives this home. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when schools closed and childcare facilities shut down, who do you think bore the brunt of that disruption? It was overwhelmingly women. Women left the workforce in huge numbers to care for children who were suddenly home all day. Women reduced their working hours. Women took on the additional labour of overseeing remote learning while also trying to work from home. And what happened? The economy counted those women as having left the workforce. Their labour, caring for children, teaching them, keeping them safe and fed and occupied, was suddenly invisible again. It did not count as work because it was not paid. It was just what needed to be done. Medieval women would understand this completely. They would recognize the pattern immediately. Work that is essential but undervalued. Labor that is constant but invisible. Contributions that keep society functioning but do not get acknowledged or compensated fairly. Here is another lesson from medieval women that we need to hear. Survival requires community. You cannot do it alone. You need networks of mutual support. You need people you can turn to in a crisis. You need to know that if you fall, someone will help you get back up. Medieval villages understood this. Yes, there was competition and conflict. Yes, people could be petty and cruel, but there was also recognition that everyone's survival depended on cooperation. You helped your neighbor repair their roof because someday you might need help with yours. You attended births and deaths together because these were communal events, too important and too dangerous to face alone. You shared knowledge and resources because hoarding them would ultimately hurt everyone, including yourself. We have lost some of this. We live in a culture that celebrates individual achievement, that tells us to be self-sufficient, that treats asking for help as weakness. We live in neighborhoods where people do not know each other's names. We live in a world where extended families are scattered across continents and we are supposed to manage everything on our own, and we are suffering for it. Mental health crises, loneliness epidemics, burnout, exhaustion, people trying to do alone what medieval villagers knew required a community. People breaking under the weight of expectations that are literally impossible to meet without support. Medieval women knew they needed each other. They built networks deliberately. They cultivated relationships carefully. They understood that independence was a myth and interdependence was survival. We need to relearn this lesson. Here is another truth that medieval women can teach us. Expertise is not the same as credentials. Knowledge is not the same as formal education. Medieval midwives did not have medical degrees. Medieval brewsters did not go to brewing school. Medieval women who grew herbs and made healing remedies did not have pharmacy licenses, but they had expertise, real, valuable, hard-won expertise developed through years of observation and practice. We have created a world where credentials often matter more than actual knowledge, where you need the right degrees and certifications to be taken seriously, regardless of what you actually know how to do, where traditional knowledge, the kind passed down through generations, learned through experience rather than institutions, is dismissed as anecdotal or unscientific. This is a loss, a real loss. Because there is knowledge that cannot be learned from books. There is expertise that only comes from doing something hundreds of times, from watching and adapting and discovering what works. Medieval women understood their bodies, their local plants, their animals, their craft techniques through this kind of embodied knowledge. And it was real. It was valuable. It saved lives and produced goods and kept communities functioning. We need to respect this kind of knowledge again. We need to recognize that grandmothers who have raised 6 children might know something about parenting that a recent graduate with a degree in child development does not. We need to acknowledge that people who've been doing a craft for decades might have insights that someone fresh out of school lacks. Credentials have value, certainly, but so does experience, so does traditional knowledge, so does practical skill. Let me tell you about another lesson, and this one might be hard to hear. Life is not fair. It was not fair in medieval times, and it is not fair now. Women worked just as hard as men and got paid less. They possessed valuable knowledge and were excluded from formal recognition. They contributed enormously to the economy and had no legal rights to property or earnings in many cases. It was unjust, deeply, fundamentally unjust, and they kept going anyway. They woke up before dawn and lit the fire. They worked all day and fell into bed exhausted. They gave birth and buried children and got up the next morning and did it again. Not because they were resigned to injustice, not because they thought it was right, but because survival required it, because their families needed them, because giving up was not an option. This is not a lesson in accepting injustice. This is a lesson in resilience, in finding the strength to keep going even when the system is rigged against you, in doing what needs to be done even when you are not getting the recognition or compensation you deserve. Medieval women had that strength. They had to, and we can learn from it even as we work to create a more just world. But here is the thing, and this is crucial. Recognizing women's strength and resilience does not mean we should accept the injustice that required it. We should not romanticize suffering. We should not say, well, medieval women managed, so modern women should just toughen up. No, the point is to recognize what women have always contributed, to acknowledge the injustice of it being devalued, and to work toward a world where essential work is recognized and compensated fairly, regardless of who does it. Let me tell you what might be the most important lesson of all. Women have always worked. Always. The idea that women working outside the home is some modern phenomenon, some radical departure from tradition, is complete nonsense. It is a lie based on a very specific moment in Western history, roughly the 1950s, when a particular class of women in a particular culture were expected to stay home while their husbands worked. That was the aberration. That was the historical oddity. For most of human history, including all of the Middle Ages, women worked. Women have always worked. Medieval peasant women worked in fields and gardens and workshops. Medieval urban women worked in shops and markets and craft businesses. Medieval noble women managed estates and ran households that were essentially small businesses. Women worked. They always have. The only question has been whether that work gets recognized and valued. So when people today talk about women entering the workforce in the 20th century, they are wrong. Women were already in the workforce. They just started getting paid for it officially and doing it in settings where it got counted and documented. Women did not suddenly start working. They started getting some recognition for the work they had been doing all along. This matters because it changes the conversation. It means we are not asking whether women should work. They always have. We are asking whether their work should be valued fairly. We are asking whether they should have access to all professions, not just the ones that society has decided are women's work. We are asking whether the work that has traditionally been done by women, caring, nurturing, maintaining households, raising children, should be respected and supported rather than taken for granted. Medieval women cannot speak for themselves anymore. Their voices have been lost to time, but their work speaks for them. The records we have, the court documents and tax rolls and inventories and coroner's reports, tell us that they were there, working, contributing, surviving, thriving in whatever ways they could manage. They were not victim waiting to be rescued. They were not passive objects in someone else's story. They were active agents in their own lives, making decisions, solving problems, doing what needed to be done. And that ultimately is what we need to remember. Medieval women were not so different from us. They loved their children. They worried about money. They had friendships and rivalries. They found moments of joy in hard lives. They had skills and knowledge and strength. They were fully human, complex and contradictory, sometimes kind and sometimes cruel, sometimes wise, and sometimes foolish, just like us. The difference is the material conditions, the tools available, the knowledge accumulated, the social structures. But the fundamental human experience, the need to survive, to provide for family, to find meaning and connection and purpose, that was the same. And if we can look back at medieval women and see them clearly, see their full humanity, see their contributions and their struggles, then maybe we can do a better job of seeing the women in our own lives clearly, of recognizing their work, of valuing their contributions, of acknowledging their expertise, of supporting them rather than taking them for granted. As the story of these medieval women comes to an end, or rather, as our telling of it comes to an end, because their story continues in the lives of their descendants, in the traditions they pass down, in the work that women still do today, we have one more thing to consider. We have walked through their days and their years, through their work and their worship, through their communities and their struggles. But what does it all add up to? What is the final truth about what life was like for women in small European villages? That is where we finish this journey, with the big picture, the final understanding, the truth that has been hiding in plain sight all along. Let me take you back one more time to that medieval village. Dawn is breaking over the thatched roofs. Smoke begins to rise from the cottages as fires are rekindled. A rooster crows. A cow lows in the distance. And in a small house near the church, a woman wakes up and begins another day. She does not know that hundreds of years from now, people will still be trying to understand what her life was like. She does not know that historians will search through dusty records to find her name. She does not think of herself as making history. She is just living, just surviving, just doing what needs to be done. But here is the truth that we have discovered on this journey. What she did, what millions of women like her did, day after day, year after year, century after century, was extraordinary. Not because it was glamorous or exciting or noteworthy in the ways that history traditionally values, but because it was essential, because without it, nothing else would have been possible. Every king who sat on a throne wore clothes that women had spun and woven. Every knight who rode to battle ate bread that women had baked and drank ale that women had brewed. Every cathedral that reached toward heaven was built by men who had been raised by women, clothed by women, fed by women, nursed back to health by women when they fell ill. Every great achievement of medieval civilization rested on a foundation of women's work. And that work was not simple or easy or unskilled. It required encyclopedic knowledge passed down through generations. It required physical strength and endurance that would exhaust most of us today. It required the ability to manage multiple complex tasks simultaneously, to make life or death decisions with imperfect information, to keep going when exhaustion and despair threatened to overwhelm everything. Let me tell you what daily life was actually like for women in small European villages. It was waking up in the dark and going to bed exhausted. It was hands that were never idle, that were always spinning or kneading or weeding or milking or mending. It were backs that ached from bending over fires and fields, fields and looms. It was feet that walked miles every day, fetching water and tending animals and working in distant fields. It was minds that held vast stores of practical knowledge, which plants healed and which poisoned, which animals were healthy and which were sickening, which weather signs meant rain and which meant fair. It was knowing that every day could bring disaster, a fire that destroyed your home, an illness that killed your child, a failed harvest that meant starvation, an accident that left you widowed and struggling. Death was always close, always waiting, and you had to keep working anyway, keep hoping anyway, keep building a life anyway. But it was also moments of joy, the satisfaction of bread rising perfectly, the pleasure of ale that turned out just right, the pride in thread spun so fine and even that weavers would seek it out, the relief when a sick child's fever finally broke, the deep contentment of sitting with neighbours on a summer evening, watching children play, sharing stories and laughter. It was community in ways that we have largely lost. Knowing everyone in your world, being known by them, having your reputation matter because these were the people you would live among your entire life, helping and being helped, sharing and being shared with, celebrating together and mourning together. It was spirituality woven into every aspect of existence. Prayers at dawn and dusk, church bells marking the hours, saints' days breaking up the monotony of work, the promise of heaven making earthly suffering bearable, Mary as mother and protector, understanding women's pain because she had felt it herself. It was oppression and injustice accepted as the natural order of things. Being paid less for the same work, being legally subordinate to fathers and husbands, having your contributions dismissed or ignored, being blamed for humanity's fall from grace, while also being expected to hold families and communities together. Living with contradictions that would make your head spin if you stopped to think about them too much. And it was strength. Incredible, undeniable, bone-deep strength. The strength to push a baby out of your body knowing you might die in the process. The strength to bury that baby and get pregnant again. The strength to work all day and then work all evening and then get up before dawn and do it again. The strength to possess valuable knowledge and skills while being told you are lesser. The strength to be essential while being invisible. Here is what I want you to understand. When we ask what daily life was like for women in medieval villages, we are not asking about some distant, foreign, incomprehensible experience. We are asking about the lives of our ancestors. Because if you have European ancestry or American ancestry that traces back to Europe, or ancestry from any part of the world where villages functioned in similar ways, then you come from these women. Your existence is proof that they survived, that they endured childbirth enough times to have children who lived, that they managed to keep those children alive long enough to grow up and have children of their own, that they passed down knowledge and values and stories through the generations until eventually here you are. You carry their strength in your DNA. You carry their resilience in your bones. You carry their knowledge in the family recipes that have been passed down, in the herbs that your grandmother swears by, in the little bits of traditional wisdom that persist even in our modern world. They are not separate from you. They are part of you. And if we are being honest, many of us still face versions of the same challenges they faced. Not as severe, thank goodness. Not as life-threatening, but the pattern persists. Women still do more housework than men, even when both work full-time jobs. Women still get paid less for equivalent work in many fields. Women's contributions are still often invisible or undervalued. The work of caring for children, for elderly parents, for sick family members still falls disproportionately on women and is still not adequately recognized or compensated. So what do we do with all of this? How do we honor these medieval women? How do we make sure their stories are not forgotten again? First, we tell the truth. We stop pretending that history is just about kings and wars and great men doing great things. We acknowledge that history is also about ordinary people doing extraordinary things just to survive. We recognize that women's work has always been essential, and that calling it women's work does not make it less important. Second, we look at our own world differently. When you see someone caring for children or elderly parents, recognize that as skilled work requiring knowledge and patience and strength. When you see someone cooking or cleaning or managing a household, understand that this is complex labor that keeps everything else functioning. Do not take it for granted. Do not assume it is easy just because it is common. Third, we fight for change. We push for fair wages for care workers. We advocate for policies that support parents and caregivers. We challenge systems that devalue traditionally female work. We work toward a world where essential work is recognized and compensated fairly, regardless of who does it or where it happens. And fourth, we remember Agnes, lighting her fire in the darkness before dawn. We remember Marjorie the widow ploughing her fields. We remember Beatrice spinning wool while watching her children play. We remember Catherine stirring pottage and trying to stretch insufficient food to feed her family. We remember Isabel praying to Mary for protection. We remember Alice navigating the complex web of village relationships. We remember all the unnamed women whose specific stories are lost, but whose collective story is written in the very fact of our existence. They were not victims. They were not saints. They were human beings living complicated lives in difficult circumstances. They did what they had to do. They found moments of joy where they could. They loved and grieved and worked and rested and laughed and cried. They were fully, completely, messily human, just like us. And if they could see us now, if they could see the world we have built on the foundation of their labour, what would they think? They would be amazed by our technology, certainly. Indoor plumbing and electricity and modern medicine would seem like magic to them. But I think they would also recognise us. They would see that we still work, we still struggle. We still love our children and worry about money and try to find meaning in our days. They would see that some things have changed enormously and some things have not changed nearly enough. But mostly I think they would be glad to finally be seen, to finally be acknowledged, to finally have someone say, yes, you were there, yes, you mattered, yes, your work was essential and your knowledge was valuable and your strength was real. We see you now, we remember you, thank you. So here we are, at the end of our journey through a medieval woman's day, her year, her life. We have walked with her from dawn to dusk, from spring planting to autumn harvest, from birth to death. We have seen her strength and her struggles. We have learned her skills and understood her sorrows. We have recognized finally what history tried so hard to hide, that women were not on the margins of medieval life. They were at the center of it. The sun is setting now over our medieval village. Smoke rises from cottage chimneys as evening meals are prepared. Women gather up their children and call them home. Fires are banked for the night. Prayers are said. And tomorrow it will all begin again. The endless cycle of work and rest, of sowing and reaping, of birth and death. The rhythm of life that continued for centuries, sustained by women's hands and women's knowledge, and women's unbreakable determination to survive. They are gone now, those medieval women. Centuries have passed. Their cottages have crumbled. Their fields have been reploughed 1,000 times. Their names, most of them, are lost to history. But their legacy remains. It remains in us, their descendants. It remains in the work that women still do, often invisible, often undervalued, but always essential. It remains in the strength that women still possess, the knowledge they still hold, the communities they still build and maintain. And now you know their story. You know what daily life was really like for women in small European villages. Not a fairy tale, not a simple story of either oppression or empowerment, but the complicated, messy, beautiful, brutal truth of human survival and human resilience and human strength in the face of impossible odds. Thank you for taking this journey with me. Thank you for listening to these stories that almost got lost forever. Thank you for helping to bring these women out of the shadows and into the light where they belong. Their work built the world we inherited. The least we can do is remember them. And if you found value in this story tonight, if you learned something or felt something or saw the world a little differently, then I hope you will come back, because there are so many more stories to tell, so many more voices to recover from silence, so many more truths hidden in the shadows of history, waiting to be discovered. Until we meet again, rest well. Dream of strong women and their strong hands building the world one day at a time. And remember, you come from survivors. You come from women who did impossible things with insufficient resources. You come from strength. Good night.